What does it mean to say that something is right or good? For a long time, people asked this question not as a puzzle to solve, but as a living matter to live by. In tracing the foundations of ethics, we stand at a crossroads where ancient questions meet modern methods, where the texture of everyday choices brushes against the cold clarity of argument, and where the quiet labor of reflection becomes a little act of courage. This is a journey through time and thought, a map of ideas about duties, about what we owe to one another, and about whether there are facts in morality that stand independent of our feelings, our cultures, or our opinions. We begin with origins, with the people who first taught their communities to ask hard questions, and we move toward the frameworks that still shape debates in law, medicine, politics, and science today. The aim is not to settle everything in a single moment, but to illuminate the questions, the stakes, and the kinds of reasoning we bring to bear when we consider how to live well. Let us begin with a turn toward the street and the marketplace of ancient Athens, where a certain kind of ethical inquiry took root not as a system, but as a method. Socrates stands at the center of this origin story. He did not write treatises or offer grand theories of virtue. He used questions to unmask the pretensions people carried about their own goodness. The elenchus, his method of refutation through dialogue, was not merely a technique of argument. It was a way of testing the reliability of one's own beliefs about conduct. If you claim to know what is right, Socrates would press you to defend that claim in the form of a rationale that anyone could accept under scrutiny. The goal was not to triumph in debate, but to reach a clearer understanding of what moral thinking requires. In the Apology, Socrates offers a sentence that still resonates: "The unexamined life is not worth living." It is a provocative claim, not an insult to ordinary life, but a reminder that moral life demands inquiry, self-knowledge, and a kind of humility before the complexity of living with others. In those dialogues, the question of virtue often enters through questions about knowledge, ignorance, and how one ought to act when a choice is hard. Socrates suggests that virtue is not a treasure hidden in a moment of impulse, but a form of wisdom about how to live. He asks, what is courage? What is justice? What is piety? The elenchus is a process of turning assumptions inside out until a more defensible ground appears. This is the seedbed for a tradition that will later turn toward the polis, toward the structure of city and soul, and toward the idea that to be human is to be bound to others by the obligations that arise when we recognize ourselves in one another. From this seed grows Aristotle, who will give us a different type of answer about how to be good. Aristotle's world is intimate with habit, with character, and with the steady cultivation of virtue. He sees the good life as a deliberate practice, a life in which moral reasoning is inseparable from daily activity. His famous claim, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit, echoes a conviction that virtue is not a one-time decision, but a way of being in the world. Yet Aristotle grounds virtue in sense and reason together. He writes that virtue is the mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Courage, for instance, is not recklessness nor timidity, but a steady, prudent balance in the face of fear. The virtue is not merely a rule to follow. It is a way of calibrating desire, perception, and action so that the agent's choices align with a coherent vision of what it means to flourish as a person in a shared life. In the Aristotelian picture, the goal of ethical life is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or the good life. The good life is not a set of external rewards, but the actual activity of living well in accordance with virtue. Aristotle emphasizes the social dimension of virtue, the idea that a person is formed by communities and institutions, and that the good life is possible only within a condition of friendship, justice, and shared deliberation. His lectures at the Lyceum, the peripatetic tradition, were not about producing a rigid doctrine, but about guiding a reflective, serious way of living. He invites us to examine the character of our desires, to study the roles we inhabit, and to understand that the moral life requires we cultivate the right dispositions, the right kind of attention to the good, and the right response to the needs of others. The ancient horizon does not end with Aristotle. The Stoics push a different, sometimes sharper, turn in the same landscape. They insist that virtue lies in living in accordance with reason and nature, regardless of outward circumstance. The Stoics teach that it is not what happens to a person that determines the quality of the life one leads, but how one responds to what happens. Epictetus, for example, counsels that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters, he says in effect, even if the words we use to translate his thought vary. The Stoic vision is quiet, austere, and incredibly practical. Cultivate constancy, discipline, and a rational stance toward the world, so that your inner life remains free as far as possible from the tyranny of external goods or misfortune. Duty in this view becomes a matter of living in harmony with a rational order, of recognizing what can be controlled and what cannot, and of choosing the best possible response within the limits of a shared human predicament. This Stoic strand leads to a shift, a transformation of ethical life as we move toward the modern era. The late 18th century brings a decisive turn with Immanuel Kant, a thinker who invites us to respect the moral law as a law that binds us by our own capacity to reason. Kant's biography, his life in Königsberg, his meticulous routine, his unwavering commitment to independence of judgment, is itself a kind of anecdote about the ethical life. He argues that morality is grounded in rationality, in the capacity to legislate for oneself, a universal principle that could be willed as a law for all rational beings. His famous command, "Act only according to that maxim," whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, grounds a form of moral obligation that is not contingent on consequences, not reducible to personal preference, and not dependent on social approval. For Kant, a good will is the anchor of ethics. The right action is that which respects the dignity of persons as ends in themselves, never merely as means. The moral law is not a law given to us by an external authority. It is the law we legislate for ourselves as rational agents, the product of our own rational will acting in universal form. In more practical terms, Kant's framework often resonates in two ways you may have felt in your own life. First, the insistence on moral autonomy and universalizable rules gives a strong sense of consistency and accountability. It matters what you could will to become a universal principle. Second, it challenges us to respect persons as ends, never treating others merely as instruments to our own ends. The consequences of actions, while morally relevant in ordinary life, do not ground rightness in Kant's account. Rather, the rightness comes from the form of the maxim and its capacity to be adopted by rational beings everywhere, at all times, without contradiction. A counterpoint to Kant's universalism emerges already in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the form of utilitarian reasoning. John Stuart Mill, building on Bentham and expanding a broader sense of happiness, argues that the moral worth of an action is determined by its tendency to promote happiness. The equation is not about the intrinsic conformity to universal law alone, but about the balance of pleasure and pain produced by actions. Mill's celebrated line, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness," offers a practical, consequence-oriented standard that many people find more intuitive to apply in real life. Yet this point of view is not simply a contradiction with Kant's. Rather, it is a rival framework, a different language for evaluating our choices, often focusing on the outcomes of actions rather than the form of the rule they express. These strands, Socratic inquiry, Aristotelian virtue, Stoic duty, Kantian universality, and utilitarian consequences, form a tradition in ethics that has shaped Western thought for 2 millennia. And as we approach the modern era, the conversation expands beyond the question of what is right to the question of what grounds the right. What do we owe to one another, and why? Is there a fact of the matter about moral claims independent of us, or are those claims ultimately expressions of our attitudes, commitments, or social conventions? This is where metaethics, our second major topic, takes the stage. Metaethics asks what moral language and moral claims really amount to. It asks whether there are objective moral truths that hold independently of what anyone thinks, or whether moral judgments depend on attitudes, conventions, or contexts. It asks whether moral realism, the idea that there are objective moral facts, can be defended, or whether anti-realist positions best capture our moral experience. It asks whether the truth of moral judgments is something knowable, and if so, how we could know it. It asks about the status of moral properties, about the role of reason in moral life, and about the relationship between moral language and the world. Within metaethics, several positions contend with one another, often in dialogue with the historical figures we have already encountered. Realism argues that there are moral facts, things that truly are right or wrong, good or bad, independent of our beliefs or feelings. Anti-realism denies that there are such independent facts. It raises questions about the status of moral claims as mere expressions of sentiment, or as dependent on social conventions, or as hypothetical devices to guide behavior rather than true or false statements about the world. Among anti-realist positions, subjectivism holds that moral judgments are about the speaker's attitudes or stances. Relativism says that moral truths are true relative to particular communities or cultures. And error theory argues that there are no moral truths at all, despite the fact that we often act as if there are. One of the oldest and most influential theorizations in this domain comes from the open question argument and the naturalistic fallacy controversy. G. E. Moore in Principia Ethica famously argued that goodness is a simple, non-natural quality. The claim that we could analytically define good in terms of natural properties, like happiness, pleasure, or benefit, begs a crucial question. Could we capture the essence of good simply by pointing to natural properties? Moore's response implies a form of antinatural realism about value. Moral properties are sui generis, not reducible to natural properties of the world. If Moore is right, then much of the traditional attempt to derive moral truths from facts about human flourishing or social welfare misses the mark. The naturalistic fallacy in his critique is the attempt to derive an evaluative predicate from a descriptive one. To assume that what seems to be good or desirable in some sense is identical with the fact that such and such is natural, or that naturalized facts can secure normative conclusions. On the other side of the debate, the 20th century saw a wave of anti-realist positions that challenged the very possibility of objective values. A classic counterpoint comes from moral anti-realism, where many philosophers argued that moral discourse is fundamentally about attitudes, commitments, or social effects rather than about objective facts. Some expressivists, for example, argued that moral judgments express approval or disapproval and do not attempt to present truth-apt propositions about the world. The late 20th century discussions about expressivism and error theory dramatize a shift in how thoughtful people understood moral language. To say killing is wrong can be understood as expressing an attitude of disapproval toward killing, rather than making a claim about a moral property existing independently of us. This turn invites a different kind of rigor. If moral talk is primarily expressive, how do we persuade one another, and what justifies moral criticism in the absence of objective standards? To ground this metaethical landscape with some vivid historical and contemporary voices, consider a few touchstones of primary source thought. Socrates, in the dialogues that come down to us through his interlocutors, is a master of questioning authority and inherited wisdom. The practice of eliciting reasons, of examining whether a claim holds under universal scrutiny, is a method that philosophically foreshadows later analytic approaches to truth conditions and justification, even if Socrates is not writing formal theory. Plato, his student, is never merely an echo of his mentor. In dialogues like The Republic, he develops a normative picture of justice, virtue, and the good that still informs debates about whether moral facts are grounded in human nature, in a rational order of the universe, or in social arrangements that nurture or thwart human flourishing. The famous Euthyphro problem, does piety come from the gods, or do the gods approve what is pious because it is pious, keeps echoing through metaethical debates as a reminder that the source of normative claims matters for their justification. Hume, writing later in the English moral tradition, challenges us to separate reason from passion in a way that still colors contemporary debates about the Azot gap. The claim that reason alone cannot move us to action, that it is the slave of the passions, invites a constructive critique of moral rationalism, but it also leaves space for rational reflection to shape our moral sentiments and to guide our social life. Kant's own work, while aiming to ground morality in the rational law of autonomy, complicates the picture by insisting that reason alone has the authority to legislate moral obligation. If we attend to his formula, act according to maxims that could be universal law, we encounter a robust normative architecture that seeks to ground ethics in the universality of rational will rather than in contingent desires alone. In modern metaethics, the debate intensifies around the status of moral judgments and the sources of values. The rise of moral realism in some quarters is often contrasted with expressivism and non-cognitivism in others. The spectrum runs from the claim that moral facts exist independently of us and can be known through rational inquiry or empirical investigation, to the claim that moral language serves non-descriptive purposes, such as expressing approval or persuading others, and thus cannot be treated as straightforwardly truth-apt in the same sense as empirical claims. The cross-currents of this debate touch on the philosophy of language, the psychology of moral emotion, and the structure of reasoning. Contemporary voices push the discussion outward into moral psychology, where hate in others trace how intuitive judgments and social pressures shape our moral beliefs, and into philosophy of language, where questions about how we use moral terms, the semantics of ought, and the role of moral discourse in social life come into sharper relief. A parallel line of thought moves us from abstract debates to normative questions about what makes actions right or good, what the sources of moral obligation are, and what role reason and emotion ought to play. In the Aristotelian mold, morality is a form of practical wisdom, a virtue ethics that relies on character and the cultivation of dispositions that enable reliable, good judgments in context. The virtue ethics approach asks how we form good characters, how we calibrate our desires, and how social practices, education, institutions, families, communities, nurture or undermine virtue. In Kant's framework, moral obligation flows from rationality and autonomy, and reason is the central instrument by which we identify universal duties. The right action is not simply the one that yields happiness or the one that aligns with my personal preferences, but the one that could be willed as a universal law and that respects the inherent dignity of rational beings. In utilitarian thinking, normative grounding is located in consequences. The good is what increases overall happiness or well-being, and the measure of right action is its tendency to promote that aggregate good, even when that means sacrificing individual interests in certain situations. Even as these normative frameworks diverge, they illuminate common ground. All of them ask how we should treat others, how to balance competing interests, and how to respond to the demands of reason in our everyday lives. They ask how to adjudicate conflicts between what we desire and what we owe to others, between the pursuit of our own flourishing and the flourishing of the people around us. They ask what kind of beings we should strive to become, and what kinds of practices will help us to become those beings. To bring these questions to life, let us consider concrete situations that illuminate the tension between rules and outcomes, between duties and consequences, and between the universal claims of reason and the intimate pull of emotion. Imagine a modern trolley-style dilemma in which you can save 5 people by diverting a trolley onto a track where a single person would die. The rule-grounded approach might say, follow a moral rule against harming innocents, a rule akin to do not kill. The utilitarian approach would push toward the outcome that saves the most lives, so divert the trolley, accepting the death of 1 to save 5. The virtue-ethical approach might ask what a virtuous agent would do in this situation, considering character, intentions, and the cultivation of courage, wisdom, and benevolence. In every version, a different ethical language is used, but in each case the human being behind the equation is the same, and the moral imagination is tested. Turn now to another forceful example, organ harvesting decisions. Suppose a patient in dire need of a transplant could be saved by a donor who has consented to donate only if certain conditions are met. The decision may hinge on questions about consent, autonomy, and the moral weight of the donor's choice, as well as the potential consequences for other patients who might be helped or harmed. A rules-based approach would emphasize consent, honesty, and fairness in allocation, perhaps following established protocols that protect the rights of donors and recipients. A consequence-focused mindset would weigh the net lives saved, the quality of life of recipients, and the potential ripple effects in the medical system. The virtue ethics perspective would call us to imagine the types of agents we want to become: compassionate physicians, responsible community members, people who speak truthfully and act with integrity, even as we navigate the hard realities of scarce resources and competing needs. Yet the moral life is not a mere calculation board of rules and outcomes. Everyday moral choices, whether to tell a friend the harsh truth about a sensitive matter or to spare them pain in a moment of vulnerability, shed light on the complexity of moral reasoning. The truth-telling case might prompt us to weigh honesty against loyalty, the duty to avoid harm against the desire to protect a friend's feelings. A rule-guided stance might say, tell the truth because honesty is a value essential to trust and human flourishing. A consequentialist might argue that a carefully calibrated lie, told to prevent unnecessary harm, yields a better overall outcome in that particular situation. A virtue-ethical reading would consider the kind of person who tells the truth in the face of discomfort, and the character traits that enable honest judgment while sustaining relationships. We must be careful, however, to acknowledge the real and persistent difficulties that arise when we move from theory to practice. Metaethics helps us think about the nature of those difficulties by drawing attention to the status of moral claims, the sources of moral authority, and the ways in which language shapes moral life. Normative ethics provides tools to test, refine, and apply principles to concrete cases. The Azote problem, articulated by Hume and echoed by much of the subsequent literature, asks how we can derive prescriptive conclusions from descriptive states of the world. If morality cannot be derived straightforwardly from facts about the world, what remains as justification for moral claims? This challenge invites us to reflect on the foundations of our own moral beliefs. Do we derive our moral commitments from rational reflection, from community norms, from emotional resonance, or from some combination of these sources? The challenge of moral disagreement is another robust counterpoint to foundational theories. Across cultures and historical moments, people disagree about fundamental moral questions: what counts as justice, what is owed to family and community, how to balance individual rights with social good. If there is a single objective moral truth that applies everywhere, why do such deep disputes persist? A realist might respond by appealing to moral facts that are discoverable through reason, experience, or both, while an anti-realist might suggest that disagreement itself is evidence that moral claims are contingent, provisional, or conditioned by human psychology and social context. The tension between universal claims and local variation invites humility and careful argument, and it pushes philosophers to articulate not only what we think is right, but why we think it is right under a shared standard of rational inquiry. Then there is the naturalistic fallacy, a charge leveled by Moore against attempts to define moral terms purely in terms of natural properties. If we try to identify what is good with what is pleasant, beneficial, or conducive to survival, we may miss something essential about value, a dimension that seems to resist reduction to natural properties and to empirical measurement alone. The challenge invites a careful, perhaps even skeptical, stance toward reductive accounts of moral life, while also allowing that empirical insights from psychology and social science can illuminate how moral judgments emerge, how values are learned, and how communities coordinate their norms to maintain social cooperation. The problem of moral luck offers another potent critique of some normative theories. Even if a person acts with benevolent intent, outcomes beyond their control can dramatically shape the moral assessment of their actions. A driver who saves a child from danger might be celebrated, while a driver who mirrors the same action but causes a fatal accident due to an unpredictable misstep is condemned. The moral luck problem forces us to grapple with whether moral judgment should be sensitive to outcomes that we cannot fully control, and if so, how to calibrate praise or blame accordingly. This issue challenges the simplicity of even careful normative theories that insist on stable moral evaluation across different contingencies and outcomes. As we navigate these debates, we can see the persistent tension between universality and particularity, between reason and emotion, between the demand for principled consistency and the messy complexity of life as we actually live it. The stories of Socrates, Aristotle, and the Stoics place a premium on inquiry, character, and habitual virtue. Kant pushes us toward respect for rational autonomy and universal laws. Mill reminds us that consequences matter in real human lives. Realism and anti-realism dispense with certainty in different ways, and the modern discourse about expressivism, relativism, and moral psychology invites us to recognize the powerful roles that language, culture, and psychology play in shaping moral life. This history, this interplay of ideas, case studies, and theoretical questions, gives us the tools we need to think about normative grounding in a grounded, practical way. It also invites cross-referencing with related thinkers who illuminate the conversation from different angles. Plato's broader questions about virtue and the form of the good offer a background against which social and personal ethics unfold. Hume's emphasis on the role of sentiment and the limits of reason as a motivational force helps us understand why moral judgments feel compelling beyond mere calculation. Confucius's emphasis on reciprocity, ritual, and communal harmony offers a non-Western mirror showing how moral life can be organized around relationships and social responsibility. Contemporary voices in moral psychology and philosophy of language, thinkers who explore how moral intuitions arise, how we reason about moral matters, and how language structures moral life, bring into view the lived texture of ethical thought in a world of scientific discovery, global interdependence, and rapidly changing social norms. And yet, a foundation in ethics is not merely a remote inventory of ideas. It is a practical toolkit for daily reflection and decision-making. It informs how we approach difficult choices, how we live with others in communities, and how we cultivate the dispositions that shape our character. If we take seriously the kind of life Socrates advocates, the life examined in dialogue, in reasoned self-government, in the readiness to challenge our own beliefs, we learn to test our commitments, to listen to others, and to refine our sense of what it means to act justly and kindly. If we attend to Aristotle, we learn that virtue is about habituation and about aligning our desires with a stable ideal of human flourishing, a shaping of our character through intentional practice. If we listen to Kant, we are reminded that we owe our actions to a law we could consistently will for all rational beings, not merely to what happens to produce the most pleasing outcomes in a given moment. If we follow Mill, we remember that the consequences of our actions in the real world matter for the happiness and welfare of others. In the modern era, the cross-currents between moral realism and anti-realism, between universal rights and cultural specificity, offer a way to appreciate the complexity of ethical life in a diverse world. The debates about whether there are objective moral facts to be discovered, or whether morality is best understood as a system of expressions of attitude or cultural norms, are not just abstract quarrels. They shape how we draft laws, how we resolve social disputes, how we care for the vulnerable, and how we educate the young in the habits of responsibility and empathy. They affect debates in medicine about patient autonomy and the allocation of resources, in business about corporate ethics and social responsibility, in politics about universal rights and cultural diversity, and in personal life about honesty, loyalty, and care for others. Let me offer a few concrete anchors that help tie these threads to practical reflection. Consider the two modern-scale dilemmas and two everyday choices as a way of seeing how foundational theories translate into lived judgment. First dilemma, the trolley-style scenario. You witness a trolley fast approaching 5 workers who cannot move in time. You have the option to pull a lever, diverting the trolley onto a side track where a single worker stands. One could argue that a rule against killing dictates not to pull the lever. Another would say that saving 5 lives outweighs this one. A virtue ethicist asks what a virtuous person would do in this moment, given the virtues of courage, prudence, and benevolence. A Kantian might insist that the maxim, save 5 at the expense of 1, could be universalized only if one would be willing to be the person in the switch position, and appeal to the universal law of actions. A utilitarian would prioritize the greatest happiness principle and choose the lever if it yields the most net good. This is not an abstract dispute. It is a real, harrowing question that invites courage, caution, and a readiness to accept that moral judgment often demands a balance between competing goods. Second dilemma, organ harvesting and life-saving medicine. Suppose a patient in need of a heart transplant could be saved by a donor who agrees to donate only if a specific procedure is allowed to proceed. The doctor faces a crisis of consent, resource constraints, and potential harm to others who might wait longer. A strict rule-based ethic might demand rigorous consent and transparent allocation policies, even if those policies slow down the process or deprive some patients of life-saving opportunities. A utilitarian calculus would weigh the number of lives saved and the quality of those lives across the system, potentially justifying policies that maximize overall welfare, even if some individuals are treated in ways that feel unfair. A virtue ethics approach would press the doctor to reflect on the kind of professional and caregiver they wish to be, to cultivate compassion with procedural fairness, and to consider the impact of their choices on public trust in medicine. The everyday moral choices, telling the truth in small matters or sparing a friend's feelings, offer a window into the texture of moral life beyond dramatic moments. Honest speech in seemingly trivial situations builds trust, but there are times when withholding or bending the truth can spare someone pain or avoid needless harm. Here the tension between obligation and tact becomes tangible. A Kantian might argue that the intention to be truthful has intrinsic worth, and that a universalized norm of truth-telling in ordinary life supports a rational order of society. A virtue ethicist would stress the cultivation of prudent honesty in context, recognizing that social relationships are often shaped more by the character behind the words than by any single statement. A utilitarian would weigh the consequences, whether speaking the truth produces more overall happiness or whether a compassionate half-truth might reduce suffering in a particular moment. And a moral psychology lens might invite us to notice how the moral intuitions we rely on are formed, by upbringing, by culture, by the immediate social setting, and how fragile or resilient they are under pressure. Across these considerations, the voices of historical anecdotes in ethics illuminate the path. Socrates in Athens, faced with the charge of corrupting the youth and impiety, embodies the ethos of philosophical courage in the face of the state and the crowd. He takes his own trial as a final test of his above-all claim, pursue the truth, even when it costs you everything. He was willing to drink the hemlock rather than yield his principles, which, in his own telling, is a demonstration of his fidelity to the life of reason. The anecdote of Kant's refusal to lie for a friend in distress, an ethical moment in which a person's personal loyalties must yield to the universality of the moral law, illustrates the strength and rigidity of a rationalist framework. Kant's famous insistence on the moral law as something one could will for all rational beings is not merely an intellectual claim. It is a way of living in which one treats humanity, even in one's closest personal encounters, as an end in itself. Aristotle's lectures on virtue, echoed in the Lyceum's steady rhythms, show us moral life as a project of habituation and judgment, the cultivation of a stable character that can meet the demands of life with poise and discernment. In the modern era, anecdotes illuminate new layers of complexity. The rise of moral realism versus expressivism is more than an abstract debate about truth. It intersects with how people understand moral progress, disagreement, and the language of ethics. The moral realist, skeptical about whether morality is merely a human invention, may look to intuitive judgments that seem to be cross-cultural and enduring in a way that hints at objective moral truths. The expressivist, by contrast, asks us to consider how much of moral discourse is about promoting attitudes rather than stating facts about the world, which changes how we think about persuasion, policy, and political life. The clash between cultural relativism and universal rights presses on contemporary politics and law, where universal human rights are challenged by diversity of cultures, religions, and social practices. Stories from the UN and from post-war justice, the defense of universal rights against particularist claims, helped shape a global discourse about what we owe to one another as members of a shared human community. If you listen closely, you can hear the voices of Plato and Hume in these modern debates, and you can hear the echo of Confucius in conversations about reciprocity, social harmony, and the cultivation of virtue across generations. You can also hear contemporary voices from moral psychology and philosophy of language, exploring how people form moral judgments, how they reason about them, and how their words function in shaping social life. Haidt's work on moral intuitions and social processes invites us to consider how emotion, social pressure, and cultural narratives shape what we take to be right. The philosophy of language, especially arguments about the semantics of ought and the nature of moral terms, invites us to examine how moral discourse connects to our actions, our beliefs about causation and responsibility, and the ways in which we explain ourselves to others when a choice goes wrong or goes right. So how do these strands come together? They provide a foundation that informs later sections of this exploration, how we approach discussions about rights, obligations, and the moral psychology behind everyday choices. They guide our daily reflection, when the thoughts at the edge of decision become words spoken to ourselves in quiet moments, when we ask whether we should tell the truth, whether we ought to help someone, whether we should act for the greater good, whether we should obey or question the rules that govern us, and how we balance reason and emotion in making sense of moral life. The foundation invites us to keep asking, to stay curious, and to cultivate a habit of reflection that remains open to revision in light of experience, argument, and life itself. As we move forward in this course, we will return to Plato and Aristotle, to Hume and Kant, to Mill and the Stoics, and to Confucius, drawing out the threads that run through their thought and that still speak to our present concerns. We will examine how metaethical questions about realism, expressivism, relativism, and the Azote problem shape our sense of what is true about ethics, and how normative questions about duty, obligation, and the good life translate into concrete decisions, policies, and practices. We will look at the interplay of reason and emotion, at how rational deliberation and moral sentiment collaborate or conflict, and at how our social selves, our families, communities, and institutions nurture or restrain the moral agents we seek to become. This foundation then becomes the compass for later sections. It frames how we interpret moral arguments in public life, how we interpret the stories of moral life in medicine and law, how we understand the language of rights and duties, and how we teach ourselves to reflect ethically in ordinary moments. It also invites us to connect daily reflection with the long arc of human thought, to see in Socrates the quiet courage to question, in Aristotle the patient cultivation of virtue, in the Stoics the discipline to respond wisely to what lies beyond our control, in Kant the call to universal law and respect for persons, in Mill the reminder that our actions ripple through others' lives. It calls us also to listen to the modern voices that push us to reconsider assumptions about whether moral facts exist, whether moral language is primarily expressive, and whether universal human rights can be reconciled with cultural diversity. In closing this exploration of origins, metaethics, and normative grounding, I invite you to carry a few prompts into your daily life. When you face a moral choice, ask yourself which tradition or framework speaks most clearly to the situation. Is this a matter of upholding a universal principle that respects the dignity of others, or is it a question of balancing consequences and people's welfare? Or is it about becoming the kind of person whose character you want to admire? Consider whether your reasoning is primarily driven by rational reflection, by compassion, by social norms, or by a mixture of all three. Reflect on how language, culture, and emotion shape your judgments, and think about how you would defend your position if someone challenged it with a thoughtful counterargument. If you can, keep a journal of moral reflections, noting how your intuitions evolved as you examine the reasons and the potential outcomes of your choices. Use the questions we have explored here to cultivate a practice of everyday ethics, a practice that aims not for certainty alone, but for a way of life that is coherent, compassionate, and responsible. This foundational work sets the stage for the next sections, where we will turn from broad theories to more specific questions, what exactly is the source of moral obligation? How do we ground normative claims in rational argument? How do we interpret moral language in light of contemporary philosophy of mind and language? How do we apply these theories to public policy, medical ethics, and personal conduct in a pluralistic world? In every case, we will bring back the central insight that ethics is not a distant, abstract discipline but a living practice, a form of consciousness that invites us to become more attentive, more just, and more humane in the ways we think, speak, and act. Welcome to a slow, careful walk through the big theories that have shaped normative ethics for centuries. If ethics is the art of living well, these four streams, deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, and care ethics, offer four different lenses for asking what we ought to do, how we ought to feel about doing it, and what kinds of persons we ought to become. In this segment, we will trace origins, sketch the major thinkers, unpack the core arguments, test them against concrete scenarios, and raise the counterarguments that keep a living tradition from becoming a dusty system. We'll move from the cold clarity of rules to the warm, messy concerns of care, and we'll keep returning to questions that matter in our ordinary lives: truth-telling at the bedside, promises kept or broken in the teeth of pressure, the way we ration scarce resources, and the way we balance loyalty with justice in the tangled web of relationships. We'll also look at how these theories interact with broader questions about moral realism and moral relativism, the role of emotions in moral judgment, and how we might balance competing theories in real dialogue and decision-making. Deontology, duties, universality, and the primacy of the law. Origins and key thinkers. Deontology rises out of a conviction that morality is not a matter of merely calculating outcomes or pleasing feelings, but of aligning our actions with laws that hold independently of particular circumstances. The tradition is most associated with Immanuel Kant, who argued that there is a rational structure to moral life that respects the autonomy of rational agents. For Kant, the ethical must be law-like in a way that can be universalized, not contingent on the fickle winds of context or preference. The law is not something external only in the sense of the state. It is, crucially, something we recognize within ourselves as agents governed by reason. In Kant's own words, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And when Kant turns his attention to persons, he adds a more demanding claim. You should act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end in itself. These are not footnotes to morality. They are the core content of moral law for the rational agent. Arguments and core ideas. Deontology begins with duties, things we owe to others simply because we are rational beings and because there is a law that binds us. A perfectly good action is one performed out of respect for the moral law, not for some anticipated reward or emotional satisfaction. In one sense, deontology is about the rightness of the intention and the form of the act rather than its consequences. The reasoning is crisp. If an action cannot be willed as a universal law, then it cannot be morally right. This universality is what protects against the tyranny of personal whim. If you lie to save a life, a deontologist might say your action could not be universalized. If everyone lied whenever it seemed to serve a good end, trust would collapse, promises would become empty, coercive manipulation would become the order of the day. The moral law is a constraint on action that preserves the dignity and autonomy of all rational beings. Two classic, concrete examples help to show the structure. First, truth-telling in a hard case. Suppose a murderer asks you where a victim is hiding, and your answer would save the victim but would also facilitate a murder if given. A strict deontologist would pause at the thought of lying, because lying is considered a violation of the moral law. The duty to tell the truth, according to Kant, stands in tension with other duties, but it remains a duty nonetheless. The problem of conflicting duties is a central challenge for the deontological frame. What happens when duties clash and cannot both be fulfilled? The second example is promising. You have promised to do something for someone, but a new obligation arises that would require breaking the promise to save a life. Here too, the duty to keep promises appears binding, yet the moral life seems to demand that we do something else, the rescue, at the cost of breaking a pledge. In hard cases, the structure of deontology pushes us toward a careful, principled assessment of whether the duty can be fulfilled in a way that does not violate the universalizable law. Historical anecdotes and context. Kant's moral law is not only a set of abstract rules, it emerged from a distinctive historical and intellectual moment. Kant did not offer a flourishing, sentimental ethic. He offered a rigorous system that sought to ground morality in the autonomy of rational agents. A famous historical vignette helps anchor this. Kant's insistence on the universality of moral law is often connected to his claims about freedom and rational legislative power within the moral sphere. It's not simply that the law applies, it is that we legislate the law for ourselves as rational agents. Another anecdote that tends to accompany Kant's portrait is the image of Kant's own life, a man said to have maintained a regimented daily routine, walks at fixed times, a strict habit of punctuality, that some readers take as a symbol of moral discipline, aligning with the universality Kant prizes. The starry heavens above and the moral law within him, this famous line, often cited, crystallizes Kant's sense that moral truth has two kinds of grandeur, the vast universe and the law that governs our conduct here and now. Quotes from primary sources, a few touchstones from Kant illuminate the tone and direction of deontological ethics. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. These sentences set the stakes for moral deliberation. Respect for rational agency, a world of moral law that binds us, and a commitment to the intrinsic worth of persons. Arguments in practice and constraints in modern life, deontological reasoning often underpins professional codes, legal obligations, and commitments we regard as inviolable. The courtroom and the clinic are two sites where a deontological sensibility tends to endure. The lawyer's oath to tell the truth, the physician's duty to respect patient autonomy, the engineer's responsibility to safety, the journalist's obligation to accuracy. Yet the theory faces well-known problems. One is the problem of conflicting duties. If two incompatible duties pull us in different directions, how do we decide which must yield? Kant himself does not fully resolve this in all cases, leading many later theorists to propose refinements, such as a ranking of duties or the idea that some duties can be treated as absolute while others are more flexible. A second challenge is the question of moral luck in difficult cases. Can truth-telling or promise-keeping be considered universally right when doing so produces a catastrophic outcome, like letting a murderer go free or betraying a life-saving secret? The deontological response is intricate. Sometimes we must act as if we could will the principle in all possible worlds, even when the world before us looks bleak. The focus remains the moral law and the rational justification for acting from duty rather than from inclination or outcome. Real-world applications and cross-references deontology has informed contractarian thought and the idea that moral norms are grounded in rational agreement among free agents. Rawls, Nozick, and Nussbaum do not speak Kantian language in every turn, but their work invites a conversation. What would a society look like if the rights of persons were given priority? Where deontology emphasizes dignity and universalizable duties, Rawls emphasizes justice as fairness and the original position as a way of testing principles. Nozick emphasizes entitlements and rights as side constraints that can limit social arrangements, sometimes challenging welfare calculations. Nussbaum pushes beyond single duties to a capabilities approach that foregrounds human flourishing as the object of justice, but even she is aware of the ethical pull of duties to persons and the importance of respecting their humanity. The dialogue among these thinkers is fruitful because it reveals where duties safeguard autonomy and where they might run up against distributive concerns. Cross-references to related ideas, moral realism and moral relativism, appear in the background of any deontological account. A robust deontologist tends to be a moral realist, willing to claim that there are objective duties rooted in rational nature. Yet, critiques from relativist or pluralist camps remind us that what seems like a universal duty may reflect a particular tradition of rationality, and that cross-cultural disagreements about the content of duties challenge any simple monism. Emotions also play a complex role. Kant famously places moral law above sentiment, but later deontologists have tried to show how emotions can be channels through which respect for law is expressed, not substitutes for it. Balancing theories in dialogue and practice, ethical decision-making rarely operates with pure, isolated theories. A real conversation about a difficult case often starts with a deontological assessment, what duties are at stake, and then considers whether consequentialist considerations or virtue-based concerns modify or contextualize those duties. In dialogue, we might ask, are we failing to respect a person's dignity by a given action? Would the action, if universalized, produce a world we want to live in? Are there virtuous traits, courage, honesty, integrity, that align with the duty or that illuminate why the duty should be interpreted in a particular way? Political philosophers like Rawls invite us to imagine principles that fair-minded rational agents would choose behind a veil of ignorance. This is a kind of thought experiment that illuminates the universal law-like character of duties. Nozick's focus on rights as side constraints helps guard against a purely utilitarian calculus that might sacrifice individuals for the sake of the greater good. And Nussbaum's capabilities approach reminds us that duties must be fitted to real human beings who need not only rules but opportunities to live flourishing lives. Consequentialism. Outcomes, happiness, and the ethics of results, origins, and key thinkers. Consequentialism begins with the claim that the rightness of an action is determined by its results. What matters most in the end is the good achieved or the welfare promoted. The tradition most associated with this line of thought is utilitarianism, with figures like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill shaping its core ideas. In Bentham's hands, ethics becomes a kind of calculus of pleasure and pain, aiming for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In Mill's hands, the calculus becomes refined by a distinction between types of pleasure, where higher quality pleasures count more than mere quantity. The utilitarian banner reads as a simple but ambitious project: maximize welfare, minimize pain, and pursue a net balance of happiness. Arguments and core ideas. The basic move is to shift the ground from the rightness of actions to the worth of outcomes. The moral act is that which produces the best overall consequences. The central tool is the hedonic calculus, the attempt to measure and compare pleasures and pains across people and over time. Bentham's formulation of the principle of utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, is straightforward in its rhetoric but demanding in its application. Mill sharpens the whole project by insisting on a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, arguing that intellectual and moral pleasures have more value than mere physical sensations, all else being equal. The practical upshot is that we should weigh consequences, predict likely effects, and choose the option that yields the best balance of happiness, but also respect certain rights and fairness considerations when calculating social welfare. Two concrete examples illuminate the theory. The first is a classic medical ethics scenario. In a triage situation during a mass casualty event, utilitarian reasoning might prioritize patients who have the highest probability of survival and the greatest number of life years saved, even if that means deprioritizing some patients who might have a more complicated or slower recovery. The second example concerns public policy, allocating scarce resources, such as vaccines or organ transplants, by maximizing total welfare, even if doing so means making difficult trade-offs that might appear unfair from a rights-based or deontological lens. These two examples illustrate the core claim of consequentialism: the right action is the one that leads to the best overall outcomes. Historical anecdotes and context. An anecdotal thread runs through Bentham and Mill that helps to illuminate the social imagination of utilitarianism. Bentham, with his famous maxim that nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, proposed a kind of scientific approach to ethics, with the hedonic calculus as a ruler and a ledger for social policy. He was a reformer who imagined legislation that would maximize happiness by shaping incentives and social institutions. The panopticon, Bentham's architectural idea for a prison, is sometimes invoked as a metaphor for the ideal of social control, where surveillance promotes welfare by producing more predictable, efficient outcomes. In his lifetime, Bentham's ideas helped spark debates about the legitimacy of state power, rights, and the role of government in promoting public happiness. Mill's life offers a vivid counterpoint to Bentham's austere calculus. He argued that pleasures differ in kind, not just degree. The famous line, though often quoted in condensed form, reminds us of his confidence that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill's emphasis on higher and lower pleasures adds a qualitative dimension to the calculus. Some pleasures are more valuable than others, and the goal is to cultivate the kinds of experiences that deserve the status of higher goods. There's also the historical anecdote about Mill's political life and his role in parliamentary reform, where utilitarian reasoning often clashed with entrenched interests, making it a living test case for the theory. Quotes from primary sources. Bentham gives us one of the most famous lines in moral philosophy: "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation." And nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Mill adds a clarifying voice: actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And a sharper moral insight about the quality of pleasures: it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And if you think a being of higher faculties would prefer the human experience even if it comes with discontent, you must recognize that higher faculties matter. These quotes anchor the language of consequentialism and illustrate how the theory translates into judgments about everyday life and public policy. Arguments in practice and constraints consequentialism's appeal lies in its straightforward logic. Look to the consequences. If we want to know what to do, we estimate effects, compare options, and choose the option that yields maximum welfare. The challenge, however, is not simply about counting happiness. It is about what counts as happiness or welfare, whose happiness matters, how to measure it, and how to weigh short-term gains against long-term costs. The critiques focus on justice and rights concerns. Can maximizing happiness justify harming a minority? Can a policy that produces the greatest total happiness still be morally unacceptable if it violates fundamental rights or erases the dignity of individuals? These questions push consequentialists to refine their theories. They might add constraints like a rule utilitarian approach, which endorses rules that tend to maximize welfare over time, or incorporate rights-based protections to ensure that individual autonomy isn't treated as a mere instrument for social welfare. Real-world applications and cross-references utilitarian reasoning has informed health policy, economic policy, and legal reform in ways that are widely recognized. In healthcare, triage protocols and cost-effectiveness analyses often align with utilitarian reasoning. Interventions that yield more lives saved or more quality-adjusted life years are prioritized. In public policy, welfare economics uses welfare-maximizing calculations to justify programs, tax systems, and social insurance schemes. Yet critics point to justice and rights concerns, an overemphasis on aggregate happiness risks, ignoring the burdens carried by minorities, individuals, or vulnerable groups. The debate with deontology often centers on whether rights should override welfare calculations, or whether some duties are inviolable regardless of outcome. Cross-references to related ideas consequentialism intersects with contractarian theories in the sense that some social contract frameworks assume that the rules of a rational society should maximize welfare for its members while protecting basic rights. It is also deeply connected to the role of emotions in moral judgment. Some modern thinkers insist that moral emotions, empathy, sympathy, compassion, can be requests for the calculus to take seriously the welfare of others, while others worry that emotions can mislead or bias the calculation. The care ethics conversation introduces a counterbalance to the impersonal weight of the calculator, reminding us that relationships, dependencies, and context matter in moral life. Balancing theories in dialogue in practical discussion, a utilitarian might welcome deontological constraints as boundary conditions that prevent abuse, while a deontologist might concede some weight to outcomes when the action is embedded in a universalizable duty. The two theories can learn from each other. A consequentialist might recognize the value of stable rights and duties to protect individuals from exploitation, while a deontologist might acknowledge the role of consequences in motivating people to adhere to duties in the first place. The best dialogue often involves a layered approach. Start with outcomes and welfare, but test the plan against principles, rights, and the kinds of lives that the policy would allow people to lead. And in the clamor of real life, we can borrow from Rawls's idea of fairness, checking whether social arrangements that maximize welfare also treat the worst off with respect and concern. Nozick's insistence on just entitlement reminds us to be cautious about policies that look efficient but undercut basic freedoms. The conversation with virtue ethics brings out the need for character and integrity in public life, reminding policymakers and citizens that lasting policies demand virtue as well as calculus. Virtue ethics, character, flourishing, and the cultivation of good lives' origins and key thinkers' virtue ethics returns us to the ancient roots of ethical thought, with Aristotle as its central figure. For Aristotle, the study of ethics begins with the good for human beings, which he identifies with eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or living well. But flourishing for Aristotle is not a mere moment of happiness. It is the activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue over a complete life. Virtue ethics shifts the focus from rules or outcomes to character. What kind of person should I become? What dispositions should nourish my choices? The idea of the mean plays a crucial role. Virtue is the mean between excess and deficiency, determined by reason and the wise person's judgments. Two classic ideas anchor virtue ethics: the function of a human being, ergon, and the aim of the virtues as the cultivation of a stable character. Aristotle asks what the good for human beings is by asking what the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue looks like over time. He is less concerned with a finite decision and more concerned with the kind of life that makes a continuous, recognizable form of excellence possible. arguments, and core ideas, the virtue-based approach invites us to see action as the expression of character. If we want to know what to do, we should ask what a virtuous person would do in the situation, and we should cultivate the dispositions that reliably lead to good action. The process of character formation, habits, training, communities of praise and blame becomes central. The famous idea that virtue is a mean between excess and deficiency helps to avoid extremes and teaches deliberation and balance. Courage, for instance, is the mean between cowardice and rashness. Generosity sits between prodigality and stinginess. Honesty finds its place between boastfulness and self-denial. The aim of virtue is not simply success or happiness, but the good life that allows a person to flourish in the fullness of human capability. Two concrete examples bring virtue ethics into view. The first concerns the allocation of scarce resources. A virtue-centered approach would not just maximize lifetimes saved or dollars allocated, it would ask what kind of person the decision would require me to be. It would stress the formation of the character of a fair, compassionate decision-maker who weighs needs with proportion and sensitivity. The second example concerns everyday moral life, caregiving in a family, and the cultivation of trust. A virtuous caregiver acts with constancy and sympathy, not merely out of obligation, but out of a durable disposition toward the good of the other. The virtuous agent seeks to cultivate the virtues that make such acts natural and reliable, such as generosity, patience, prudence, and practical wisdom, phronses. Historical anecdotes and context. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, is the stage for many such stories. The philosopher who would shape the idea of virtue as a mean, an ethical life that seeks balance, lived in a world in which public life and civic education were tied to the cultivation of character. A famous historical anecdote often told clutches Aristotle's idea to the life of leadership. Alexander the Great, allegedly studying under Aristotle, embodies the tension between the ideal of virtuous deliberation and the actual exercise of power. While the anecdote is more legend than strict historical fact, it captures the sense that virtue ethics is not only about private virtue, but the way a person moves in the world, in relation to others, and in public life. Two modern expansions of Aristotle's thought illuminate the way virtue ethics has continued to inspire contemporary theorists. Elizabeth Anscombe's critique helped to revitalize virtue ethics by challenging the dominance of consequentialism and deontology in the 20th century. Rosalind Hursthouse, among others, has offered a modern account of virtue ethics as a practical guide for action, focusing on character, moral psychology, and the role of institutions in shaping virtuous dispositions. Alastair MacIntyre's influential revival emphasized tradition, community, and narrative, the ways in which a life of virtue unfolds within a network of practices and institutions. Quotes from primary sources. Aristotle's own voice gives us several enduring lines. He writes that the good for human beings is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and he notes that virtue is a mean between extremes. Virtue is the mean because the mean, being in a state of balance, avoids the extremes of excess and deficiency. He also asserts that the virtuous life is a life of activity in accordance with reason. The good for man is to live in accordance with reason, and virtue then is the disposition to act in the right way. While modern translations may vary, these sentences capture the spirit of his view that moral knowledge is not a rulebook but a cultivation of character across a whole life. Arguments in practice and constraints. Virtue ethics shines in morally rich, culturally particular situations where the lines between right and wrong are not simply drawn by a rule or a calculation. It emphasizes moral education, the formation of good habits, and the social environment that fosters virtuous agents. Yet the theory faces two common objections. First, action guidance ambiguity. Given many virtues in tension with one another, how do we decide which virtue to exercise in a given moment? Courage might conflict with honesty in a tricky context. Generosity might collide with justice if resources are too limited. Virtue ethics has to explain how to prioritize virtues in action. Second, cultural variation. Different communities cultivate different virtues and traditions. Some critics worry that virtue ethics risks subjective or relativistic judgments about what counts as a virtue. Proponents answer with an appeal to human flourishing and rational agreement about the kinds of person we should become, and they point to cross-cultural debates as a place to refine what counts as a flourishing life in various contexts. Real-world applications and cross-references. The virtue approach has a long history in education and professional ethics. It asks, what kind of person should a physician, judge, teacher, or engineer strive to be? It emphasizes virtue cultivation, not merely compliance with external rules. It invites cross-referencing with modern capabilities approaches, can a society teach and nurture the virtues that enable people to live good, flourishing lives? It also connects to discussions of moral realism. Are there objective virtues, or are virtues entirely culturally constructed? The answer depends on whether one believes that virtuous dispositions exist independently of our social practices, or whether virtue is inseparable from the communities and practices that shape it. Care ethics, relationality, dependency, and context origins and key thinkers. Care ethics emerged most prominently in the work of Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings during the late 20th century, as a response to what many perceived as an overemphasis on justice, rights, and impartiality in traditional moral theories. Care ethics foregrounds relationships, dependency, and context. It emphasizes the moral significance of caring relations, between parent and child, between nurse and patient, between friends, and within communities. The core claim is not that justice is unimportant, but that care provides a distinct and indispensable voice in moral life. It highlights how we are all embedded in networks of dependence and vulnerability, and it argues that ethical reasoning should reflect those particularities of concrete relationships. Two well-known strands emerge from this tradition, one associated with Gilligan's work on the voice of care in moral development, and another associated with Nell Noddings' articulation of caring as a relational pedagogy and moral orientation. The care ethics conversation emphasizes partiality in moral concern and the ethical weight given to those with whom we stand in particular relationships. It invites a shift from an abstract calculation to the intimate and local obligations that arise from interdependence. Arguments and core ideas. Care ethics insists that moral discernment must attend to the needs, vulnerabilities, and dependencies of those in our care networks. It emphasizes attentiveness, responsiveness, and responsibility within the fabric of relationships. In a caregiving scenario, the moral choice might be less about principled universality and more about the right response in context. The mother who knows her child's needs, the nurse who recognizes a patient's subjective experience, the friend who understands a neighbor's loneliness. The relational focus invites a critique of impartiality when it ignores the particular demands of care. It also critiques the idea that moral theory should be justified primarily through abstract universals. Instead, it offers a pragmatic framework in which the context and the quality of relationships shape ethical decisions. Two concrete examples illustrate care ethics in action. First, caregiving within a family dynamics. A parent present with a child who is ill, balancing attention, time, and emotional support, recognizing the relational obligation to the vulnerable member, and prioritizing continuous, responsive care even when it conflicts with other duties or personal goals. Second, caregiving in professional settings. A nurse or social worker who must decide how to allocate limited resources, taking into account the particular needs, histories, and relationships involved. The decision is grounded not in abstract calculations of happiness or rights alone, but in the specific meaning of care in that moment for that person. Historical anecdotes and context. Gilligan's work in the 1980s, based on interviews with boys and girls about moral development and moral reasoning, brought to light a perceived difference in how individuals reason about moral issues. Her studies suggested that women were more likely to foreground care and responsibility in relationships, while men were more likely to foreground justice and rights. The result was a provocative reorientation of ethics toward the feminine voice of care, a shift that sparked a broad debate about gender, morality, and the aims of ethical theory. Nell Noddings' own work in the 1980s and 1990s furthered the relational approach, emphasizing the moral significance of caring as a practical and educational virtue. In her account, caring becomes not only a feeling but a practice, an orientation toward others that can be cultivated through relationships and school environments. Quotes from primary sources. Care ethics is often introduced with a clear articulation of its stance on relationship and responsibility. Gilligan's own work emphasizes a different voice in moral life, highlighting the relational, contextual, and care-centered approach. Noddings offers a compact, influential formulation in her writings. Caring is a relational practice that underpins moral life. The moral life is sustained through caring relationships. A recurring line in care ethics is that moral reasoning must begin with the concrete needs and vulnerabilities of those we are connected to, rather than merely abstract rules or impersonal calculations. The care perspective calls attention to the textures of daily life, the way one person's pain and joy ripple through a network of relationships. Arguments in practice and constraints. Care ethics faces questions about partiality and justice. If our moral reasoning should privilege those closest to us in relationships, doesn't that risk nepotism or favoritism, and how do we avoid systemic unfairness? Critics worry that the emphasis on particular relationships can erode impartial commitments that protect strangers and minorities. Proponents respond that partiality is a natural and often necessary feature of moral life, and that justice can be advanced through care when relationships are acknowledged and included in the rule of fairness. Critics also worry about the risk of emotional partiality becoming an excuse for irresponsible or biased action. The care approach must therefore cultivate not only sensitivity and responsiveness, but also critical reflection about when and how care should extend beyond intimate relationships to the wider social good. Real-world applications and cross-references care ethics has found a vibrant place in fields such as medical ethics, nursing, education, and social policy. In medicine, it invites professionals to consider how to respond to patients' lived experiences, values, and preferences. In education, it frames the teacher-student dynamic as a caring relationship essential to learning. In social policy, it pushes for structures that support caregiving labor, recognize its value, and distribute its burdens more equitably. The relational emphasis also dialogues with virtue ethics by stressing character traits like empathy, responsiveness, and responsibility, and it softens the absolutism of some rights-based accounts by insisting that moral obligations are grounded in the matrix of human relationships. Cross-references to related ideas care ethics interacts with moral psychology and the study of emotions, how feelings, attachments, and attentiveness inform moral judgments. It also intersects with feminist ethics, which has used care as a lens to analyze power, vulnerability, and social injustice. It intersects with contractarian ideas in that caregiving networks may shape social contracts differently than impartial, universalistic theories would predict. And it interacts with the broader debate about moral realism and relativism by asking whether care-based obligations reflect universal needs, the vulnerability and dependence that all humans experience, or culturally particular practices of caregiving. Balancing theories in dialogue and actual moral life, we rarely have pure care moralities, pure deontological rules, or pure utilitarian calculations. Each theory offers sturdy rails for moving forward, but each also risks gaps or distortions when used in isolation. A useful approach is to imagine a decision that begins with attentiveness to relationships and needs, care, tests actions against universalizable duties, deontology, and then weighs the consequences for overall welfare and justice, consequentialism. A nuanced dialogue might ask, what obligations arise from caring relationships, and how do they align with universal duties or social welfare? Do duties to others as ends coexist with the demands of care? These questions invite a dialogic ethic in which the most defensible answer is the one that respects the dignity of persons, acknowledges the importance of relationships, and aims at flourishing for all involved. Two simultaneous threads across theories, practical examples and the role of emotions across all four streams. We can observe how practical examples illuminate the moral problem and how emotions shape the deliberation. In deontology, the role of emotion is often subordinated to rational duty, but emotions like respect for persons can catalyze the recognition of duty. In consequentialism, emotions can be part of the calculus. Our empathic response to suffering informs our judgments about what happiness or welfare requires. In virtue ethics, emotions are not obstacles but resources. The cultivation of dispositions includes developing the right kinds of feelings toward others, such as sympathy and compassion. In care ethics, emotions are inseparable from moral reasoning. The very core of the approach is how we respond to vulnerability with care, attention, and responsibility. The crosstalk is not merely about which theory to endorse. It is about how to weave elements from each into a robust, practical approach to living well in the real world. Historical anecdotes and cross-references across streams to keep the conversation grounded in human history and human stories. Let's return to a few connective threads. Kant's insistence on the universal law has a clarifying clarity that helps us think about moral duties in institutions and personal life alike. But the care-oriented and virtue-oriented responses remind us that moral life unfolds in particular moments with personal relationships in view. Bentham's and Mill's utilitarian thought is a powerful counterpoint to deontology and virtue ethics, showing how broader social welfare can guide policy, but also how it can neglect the dignity of individuals if taken to extremes. Aristotle's teleology, the goal-oriented life, invites us to see ethics as a quest for human flourishing, rather than a mere compliance with rules or mere success in navigating consequences. Finally, Gilligan and Noddings remind us that moral life cannot be fully comprehended without attention to how care, empathy, and relational obligations shape our judgments, not merely as side considerations, but as central features of what it means to act well in a human community. Cross-references to the broader philosophical landscape, all four streams engage with larger debates about moral realism and moral relativism. Are there objective duties? Are there optimal happiness patterns? Are there universal virtues? And are there universal obligations of care? Each theory makes its own claim, and each is attentive to the limits and temptations of purely formal reasoning. They also intersect with contractarian thinking. What would rational agents endorse if they were constructing a social contract under conditions of fairness, rights protection, and the aim of flourishing? They also intersect with the role of emotions in moral judgment. To what extent should we cast emotions as fuels for moral action or as obstacles to rational adjudication? And they connect to contemporary debates in political philosophy, how to balance liberty, equality, and care within a pluralistic society. The conversations with Rawls, Nozick, and Nussbaum offer fruitful points of contact. Rawls's idea of justice as fairness and the original position provides a criterion for evaluating social arrangements. Nozick's emphasis on rights as constraints helps protect individuals against coercive or exploitative policies. Nussbaum's capabilities approach offers a way to connect the virtues and the social supports necessary for a flourishing life. Practical conclusions. Balancing the big theories in dialogue and decision-making. If you take these four streams together, you get a comprehensive framework for ethical deliberation that respects both the universality of moral law, the consequences of our actions for human flourishing, the developmental and character-focused aspects of living a good life, and the intimate, relational duties we owe to those closest to us. A thoughtful approach is to start with a careful assessment of the action in front of you, what duties might be implicated, what outcomes could follow for the welfare of the many and the protection of rights, what virtues would guide a person who faced this situation, and what caregiving obligations arise from the relationships at stake. Then consider the broader social context. Do distributional concerns require attention to justice for the vulnerable? Are there obligations to protect the institutions that make care possible, for example, family life, health care systems, and education? Finally, engage in dialogue with others who hold different views, listening for where duties, outcomes, character, and care illuminate the path forward, and where they push back against one another. A closing reflection on the integration of theory and life. The four streams do not merely supply a toolbox from which we pick a single tool for any given problem. They invite a richer practice, a way of thinking and living that recognizes the dignity and autonomy of persons, the importance of humane outcomes, the cultivation of wise character, and the primacy of care in the folds of our relationships. The best ethical decisions, whether in the clinic, the courtroom, the classroom, or the kitchen table, often require listening to multiple voices. They require asking not only what is the right act, but also what would a good person do? Who is affected? What would fairness look like in this situation? How does care shape my obligations? How can I protect the vulnerable while honoring responsibilities I owe to others? The thinkers we have considered: Kant and the moral law, Bentham and Mill and the calculus of happiness, Aristotle and the art of virtue, Gilligan and Noddings and the call to care, do not offer a single, universal answer. They offer an education in moral imagination, a repertoire of questions, and habits of mind that help us become not only more prudent in our actions, but more generous, more reflective, and more human. A final note on the living nature of ethics. Ethics is not a museum of fixed doctrines, but a living conversation that shifts with history, culture, and personal experience. The great theories do not end up locking us into cages. They invite us into a dialogue about how to live well with others. The aim is not to win a theoretical victory, but to cultivate ways of thinking and acting that sustain human dignity, promote genuine flourishing, and foster relationships that nourish the best parts of ourselves. In this sense, the big theories are not adversaries, but companions on a long, patient journey toward wiser, more compassionate, and more just shared life. If you're listening to this, slow down for a moment. Let the ideas settle in your mind the way a tide withdraws and returns. Think of a concrete scenario you faced or might face, a decision at work, a moment of care for someone you love, a policy question about how to allocate scarce resources. Let each theory come forward: the deontologist's call to duty and universal law, the utilitarian's eye on outcomes and welfare, the virtue ethicist's invitation to become a certain kind of person, the care ethicist's emphasis on relationship, dependency, and context. Then listen to your own sense of what would be most humane, most fair, most true to the relationships you value, and most aligned with a life you would be proud to call yours. Ethics, in the end, is a shared practice of becoming more thoughtful about how we live together, and that is a journey worth taking with patience, curiosity, and care. Ethics in practice: personal, professional, and public life. Translate theory into practice across intimate and public spheres. We begin by recognizing that ethics is not a dry set of rules stored in a textbook. It is a living conversation we carry in our daily breaths, in the rooms where we choose to speak truth or silence, in the laboratories and clinics where lives are saved or altered, in the courts and boardrooms where power, money, and responsibility collide, and in the streets and forums where millions hinge on what we decide to do together. The aim of this exploration is not to provide one right answer to every question, but to illuminate the questions themselves. How we weigh autonomy against beneficence and care, how professionals balance duty and risk, how technology tests our commitments to justice, and how communities, nations, and international actors share a fragile planet with a reckoning that grows louder with every failure to listen. Along the way, we will hear echoes from the past, from the Hippocratic Oath to Gandhi, from Enron's rise and fall to the rise of professional codes, and we will weave those echoes into a living practice that speaks to doctors, lawyers, engineers, journalists, policymakers, parents, patients, workers, and all of us who must live with the consequences of our choices. Let us begin with the most intimate sphere, personal morality. In our daily lives, honesty becomes a touchstone not only of trust, but of the kind of person we want to be. Honesty in its simplest form is a commitment to tell the truth, to own one's mistakes, to resist the temptation to obscure, to protect others from deception. But honesty is not merely a tactic for social convenience or a weapon in argument. It is a virtue that shapes how we relate to others, how we understand ourselves, and how we handle the delicate balance between privacy and candor. When we tell the truth, we honor the moral claim that others have to know what affects them, and we also cultivate an inner coherence that makes our choices legible to our own conscience. Yet honesty also encounters limits. There are moments when a direct disclosure can cause unnecessary harm, when the truth must be weighed against the relief of a frightened person or the dignity of a vulnerable moment. The philosopher's task in such moments is to ask, does telling the whole truth at once serve the better end of flourishing for all involved, or does it risk needless harm to someone who cannot bear it? This is not a pure calculation. It is a living tension that requires care, humility, and a willingness to listen. Generosity, in turn, expands the circle of responsibility beyond self-interest. It is not merely about giving money or time, though those are common expressions of generosity. It is the posture of measuring one's needs against the needs of others and choosing to act in a way that benefits another without expecting a reward. Generosity is not synonymous with naive self-sacrifice. Rather, it is a disciplined cultivation of concern that recognizes interdependence. In everyday life, generosity tests us in quiet ways, sharing a seat with a tired stranger, offering food to someone who cannot afford it, mentoring a younger colleague even when our own load remains heavy. The virtue of generosity invites a feminist ethics of care, which insists that relationships matter, that dependency and vulnerability are not defects but facts of our condition, and that ethical life must be attentive to particular needs, contexts, voices, and histories. When generosity and honesty coexist, we create social spaces in which trust can grow, disagreements can be debated, and the human price of indifference becomes visible. End-of-life choices present perhaps the most challenging intersection of autonomy, truth-telling, and beneficence within personal morality. They force us to balance respect for a person's self-determination with the community's impulses toward relief from suffering, and they expose the fragility of our souls when faced with terminal uncertainty. The modern medical landscape has been shaped by a powerful tension: the patient's right to decide what happens to their own body, and the caregiver's duty to propose options that maximize relief from pain and the prolongation of meaningful life. The Hippocratic tradition begins with a pledge not to harm, a line captured in the enduring mantra, primum non nocere. But as medical science has grown more potent, so too has our capacity to intervene in ways that few generations could have imagined. The question becomes not simply what can be done, but more importantly, what should be done given who the patient is, what they value, and what they fear. To illuminate this, consider two real-world, morally urgent situations that often appear on the threshold between autonomy and beneficence. In the first, a patient with advanced cancer receives a recommendation for chemotherapy after years of living with the disease. The treatment offers a glimmer of hope, but brings with it a heavy burden of side effects, uncertain benefit, and a risk of the patient's remaining days being consumed by hospitalizations, fatigue, and physical decline. The patient, dreadfully aware of the odds, declines the therapy, expressing a wish to spend remaining days at home with family, embracing comfort-focused care rather than aggressive treatment. The clinician faces a dilemma. Should they honor the patient's stated wishes even if they believe that chemotherapy, for some, might offer a chance, however slim, of extended life? Here the bedrock principle of autonomy becomes the compass. Yet beneficence calls for acting in the patient's best interests, which in this frame includes honoring the patient's own values, quality of life, and definitions of relief from suffering, not simply maximizing length of life. The physician's task is to enter into shared decision-making, to articulate the likely outcomes of both pursuing and foregoing treatment, to listen for the patient's narrative of meaning, and to support a plan that aligns with what the patient holds dear. The ethical move is not to win the argument, but to join the patient in a journey where truth-telling, respect, and compassionate concern shape the course. In a second scenario, a patient with fluctuating capacity due to a chronic neurological condition faces decisions about a life-sustaining intervention during a crisis. The medical team must decide whether to initiate or continue a treatment, such as resuscitation, when the patient's ability to express preferences is compromised. Here, the ethical framework shifts to the best interest standard substituted judgment, and crucially, the role of surrogates who know the patient's values. The family may push for maximal efforts because of fear of death or guilt about letting go. The clinicians may push back toward what clinical data suggest is most likely to bring comfort and avoid futility. The tension is not merely about who has authority, but about whose values are being honored in those critical hours. The patient's own values, the family's sense of responsibility, and the clinician's professional obligation to minimize harm. The language of do no harm surrounds both choices. But as we reflect, we notice that harm is not only physical. Harm can be a life that loses its meaning, or a person who endures unnecessary suffering because their story remains unspoken or unheard. The right answer, if one could ever claim there is a single right answer, emerges when the care plan is co-created through honest dialogue, with provisions for palliative options, clear communication about prognosis, and respect for the patient's narrative of what constitutes a life worth living. Across these personal struggles, we sense how personal morality connects with broader ethical traditions. The principle here is not rigid rules, but a cultivated sensitivity to the person before us, the context we inhabit, and the limits of our own knowledge. A feminist ethics of care invites us to foreground relationships and vulnerability, to acknowledge that autonomy is not the same as isolation, and that responsible action arises from attentive listening to the needs, fears, and hopes of others. A legal ethical perspective highlights the role of informed consent, patient rights, and the safeguards that prevent coercive or paternalistic practices, while a medical ethical framework like Beauchamp and Childress's four principles, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, offers a vocabulary for balancing competing duties. We can also hear the echo of the Hippocratic aspiration as a living instruction to use our knowledge to alleviate suffering, while Gandhi's emphasis on nonviolence and responsibility invites us to consider how our choices ripple outward, shaping communities and futures. In practice, honesty and generosity do not simply guide personal behavior. They become scaffolds for relationships in which difficult conversations can occur, doubt can be named, and care can be organized with humility and courage. The path from personal morality to professional ethics then opens with another set of questions. How do we translate ideals we cherish into safe, fair, and compassionate professional action? How do we maintain trust when systems press for efficiency, profit, and speed, and when those pressures risk dehumanizing the very people we are meant to serve? The move from private virtue to professional duty invites us to consider a broader architecture of ethics, one that recognizes the equal importance of individual conscience and collective standards, of local care and global accountability. Let us turn now to the realm of professional ethics in medicine, law, engineering, and journalism, where the stakes are most palpably public, and the consequences of negligence or moral compromise can ripple across communities. Central to professional ethics is the idea that expertise does not give license to disregard the rights and well-being of others. Rather, it imposes duties anchored in a shared human interest in dignity, safety, and justice. The best modern articulation of these duties is found in the medical ethics of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. In legal ethics, the obligation to pursue truth, uphold fairness, and protect the vulnerable. In engineering and journalism, a responsibility to accuracy, public welfare, and accountability. And in the philosophy of technology, a concern for how innovations shape power, privacy, and the social order. We may cross-reference a diverse family of ethical theories, deontology, virtue ethics, and consequentialism, while insisting that professional ethics be anchored in public trust and the practical realities of the professions we inhabit. In medicine, the interplay between autonomy and beneficence is perhaps most vivid. A clinician's duty to respect patient choices coexists with a duty to help patients avoid harm and to promote healing where possible. In law, the obligation to uphold due process and protect clients' rights must be balanced against the social interest in maintaining justice and the integrity of the legal system. In engineering, the ethical challenge is to ensure safety, reliability, and accountability when people's lives may depend on the functioning of a structure, a device, or a system. In journalism, the imperative to report truthfully with independence and accountability collides with pressures to attract audiences, manage sensationalism, or avoid censorship. Across these fields, formal codes and professional associations supply normative guardrails, codes of ethics, standards of practice, and institutional review processes that aim to prevent abuses and to align professional action with the public good. Yet codes alone do not guarantee virtue. The character and judgment of individual professionals and the organizational cultures in which they operate matter immensely. To make these reflections concrete, we now turn to two distinct case studies from medicine, two from the broader professional ethics landscape, and two cross-cutting ethical challenges that illuminate the health of the profession in modern society. Each case invites us to weigh competing duties, to listen to the patient's or citizen's voice, and to translate principle into practice in a way that remains faithful to both theory and human need. Case Study 1. Medical autonomy and beneficence in patient care. A middle-aged patient with a previously stable chronic illness experiences a sudden deterioration. The patient has always valued their independence, desires to make their own decisions, and has a strong sense of what would constitute a meaningful life for them at this stage. After thorough discussion, the patient refuses a recommended curative treatment that has only a modest probability of success and significant burdens in terms of side effects and hospitalization. The medical team is torn between the patient's autonomous choice and their own professional judgment that pursuing the aggressive treatment would provide a chance, however small, for extension of life and potential relief from anxiety for the family. The ethical task is to honor the patient's autonomy while ensuring that the patient fully understands the risks, benefits, and alternatives, and to offer comfort-focused options that align with the patient's values. In this vignette, shared decision-making becomes the functional core. It requires clinicians to speak with candor about prognosis, to explore the patient's goals, e.g., remaining at home with minimal burden, pursuing symptom relief, or seeking time with loved ones, and to facilitate a care plan that respects the patient's narrative of meaning. From an applied ethics perspective, this case embraces Beauchamp and Childress's autonomy principle, while recognizing the beneficence principle's call to reduce harm and ensure that care aligns with what the patient would want, not solely what the clinician believes is best. It also invites the justice principle, ensuring the patient's care does not defend a biased standard that privileges some outcomes over others merely because of resource considerations. The legal ethical dimension emphasizes informed consent, documentation, and the rights of the patient to accept or refuse treatment, while also considering the role of advance directives and surrogate decision-makers when capacity is challenged. Case Study 2. Informed consent, surrogate decision-making, and end-of-life in critical care. In an ICU, a patient who has lost capacity is connected to life-sustaining machines after a severe event. The family advocates for continuing aggressive treatment at all costs, while the medical team reasons that the risks and burdens of ongoing intervention outweigh the likelihood of a meaningful benefit. The clinicians must navigate the substituted judgment standard, respect the patient's previously stated preferences when known, and avoid projecting their own values onto the patient's life. The ethics here revolve around balancing the duty to preserve life with the duty to respect patient autonomy post hoc, and the duty to avoid non-beneficial, burdensome care. The discussion naturally leads to palliative care integration, the importance of early goals of care conversations, and the role of ethics consultation when consensus seems unattainable. This case foregrounds the tension between pursuing life-extending technology and honoring a patient's concept of a life worth living. It also shows how professional ethics relies on institutional structures, the availability of interpretable advance directives, the presence of ethics committees, and robust communication protocols to prevent a drift toward paternalism or coercive decision-making. In the broader professional ethics conversation, the same principles ripple outward. A physician's duties reflect the medical ethics canon, yet those duties intersect with legal ethics, hospital policy, and resource stewardship. The same pattern appears in engineering, where safety and accountability must be designed into systems from the outset. In journalism, where truth-telling and transparency must be safeguarded against financial or political pressures. And in law, where the obligation to defend clients or to pursue justice must be anchored in legal and moral reasoning that transcends personal interest. The rise of professional codes has been essential in this regard. The Hippocratic Oath gave a language of responsibility to physicians a millennium ago. Since then, the formalization of professional ethics has grown into diverse codes, covering patient confidentiality, non-maleficence, conflict of interest rules, and standards for professional conduct. The evolution continues. Along with the Hippocratic tradition, we must incorporate feminist ethics of care, which emphasizes relational accountability and the social conditions shaping patients' lives. We must consider the legal ethical frameworks that guard against coercion. We must attend to issues of justice in access to care and disparities in outcomes. And we must recognize the role of the philosophy of technology in how medical devices, data analytics, and digital health platforms transform the boundaries of care, privacy, and autonomy. To bring in historical texture and cross-reference with primary sources, we can hear the echo of the Hippocratic Oath that has long guided medical practitioners. The oath's spirit is one of responsibility to patient welfare, a phrase that continues to shape modern ethics codes. Do no harm, seek patient welfare, respect patient autonomy, protect confidentiality, and practice medicine with integrity. That oath has evolved as medicine has advanced, and ethical thought beyond the oath has matured into a complex framework of principles that both extend and challenge its original commitments. The rise of professional codes, ethical guidelines in medical associations, in engineering societies, and in journalism boards reflects a broader historical shift, from authority grounded in tradition to authority anchored in collective standards and accountability. The 20th century brought not only the Declaration of Helsinki for medical research ethics, but also ongoing debates about informed consent, patient autonomy, and the fair distribution of health resources. These code-based norms help practitioners avoid the drift toward paternalism and instead cultivate a culture of transparency, respect, and shared responsibility. The Enron disaster, though not a medical scandal, offers a cautionary tale about professional integrity and the consequences of a culture that prizes performance over truth, a reminder that professional ethics is meant to protect the public, not merely to preserve reputations or profits. The organizational memory of professional codes and ethics, then, becomes an essential guidepost for doctors, lawyers, engineers, and journalists as they navigate a world in which technology accelerates risk, information flows more freely, and public trust becomes an increasingly scarce resource. History also teaches us about the role of codes in shaping professional communities. The rise of professional ethics codes can be seen alongside the emergence of professional associations and the social contract that binds professionals to the public. The early modern and modern periods witnessed a rapid expansion of professional self-definition. Individuals who pledged to certain standards, who created peer review processes, who accepted accountability for misbehavior, and who formulated norms of practice intended to ensure public welfare. The ethical life of professions is not a mere sum of rules. It is a living culture that requires ongoing interpretation, critique, and repair. Philosophically, this is a reminder that ethics is dynamic. It is not a static repository of imperatives, but a living conversation about what counts as responsible practice in changing times, where new technologies, new social expectations, and new forms of harm demand renewed attention to the old commitments of autonomy, beneficence, justice, and non-maleficence. A sense of how professional ethics intersects with other domains can be gained by cross-referencing with legal ethics, environmental ethics, feminist ethics, and the philosophy of technology. In legal ethics, the lawyer's obligation to uphold justice and protect client confidences sits at the core of public trust in the rule of law. In environmental ethics, engineers and policymakers are called to weigh the long-term consequences of infrastructure and industrial activity on ecosystems, on communities, and on future generations. Feminist ethics adds a critical dimension by highlighting how gendered power dynamics shape access to care and information, demanding that professional practices be attentive to women's voices, caregiving burdens, and the particular vulnerabilities of marginalized groups. The philosophy of technology asks us to examine how new devices and algorithms reconfigure power relations, privacy, and accountability. It asks whether our tools extend or diminish moral agency. By cross-referencing these strands, we see that professional ethics is not a collection of isolated rules, but a coordinated practice of reflection, dialogue, and action that seeks to align professional life with the best available moral understanding and the best available means to realize human flourishing. If we turn now to the public dimension of ethics, the application of ethical reasoning to climate policy, social justice, and global humanitarian concerns, we enter a terrain where values collide with political realities, where the futures of billions hang on policies made today, and where the pressure to act swiftly can tempt us into oversimplified or expedient choices. In this arena, two powerful threads deserve emphasis: climate justice and intergenerational ethics, and the practical politics of humanitarian action. The idea of climate justice rests on the conviction that environmental burdens and benefits do not fall evenly across populations. Rather, wealthier nations and higher-emitting actors often bear less immediate consequences, while poorer communities bear the brunt of climate change impacts. Intergenerational ethics extends this concern across time, insisting that the choices we make today must be judged by how they shape the conditions of life for those who come after us. This requires a careful balancing of interests: the present generation's development and livelihoods versus the rights and needs of future generations, and the admission that some sacrifices may be necessary now to reduce harm later. The substantive question becomes, what counts as a fair distribution of costs and benefits across generations? The answer is not straightforward. It must reckon with economic justice, ecological limits, technological possibility, and political legitimacy. The Paris Agreement and subsequent policy debates provide a living laboratory for these questions, inviting us to consider not only carbon targets, but the ways in which those targets are pursued. Who pays, who invests, who bears risk, and who benefits from stability and resilience? Case Study 3, Environmental Ethics and Intergenerational Justice. A country faces a hard monetary choice. It can subsidize a coal-fired power plant that sustains jobs in a region with high unemployment, or it can accelerate the transition to renewables that would save the climate in the long run, but cost short-term jobs. The choice is not only about energy sources, it is about justice for workers, communities, and future generations. If the policy choice is to keep the plant open, one must confront the present harm to air quality, increased climate risk, and the burden placed on future citizens who will inherit degraded ecological systems. If the policy choice is to shut the plant and invest in retraining and social supports, one must confront the immediate economic hardship of workers who lose income and the political pushback that may threaten social cohesion. The ethical framework here is built on distributive justice, the precautionary principle, and intergenerational justice. It asks, how do we design transitions that minimize harm to those who have depended on old industries while maximizing opportunities for sustainable growth and fairness for those who will bear the consequences of today's decisions? It also invites an inquiry into the responsibilities of ascribing moral worth to ecological systems. Should forests, rivers, and oceans be granted rights, or at least formal protections that reflect their intrinsic value and their instrumental value to current and future generations? Case Study 4, Public Climate Policy and Global Humanitarian Concerns. In a world of geopolitical complexity, a country faces the tension between national interests and global humanitarian obligations. It may be pressed to secure its own energy supplies and economic well-being at the expense of broader climate action or climate finance commitments that would benefit the most vulnerable regions. How do we sustain international cooperation when climate change is both a shared hazard and a strategic point of leverage? The ethical discussion here is not merely about choosing a policy path, but about building institutional norms that can withstand political pressures. It involves the design of climate finance mechanisms that deliver real support to communities facing climate-induced displacement, the creation of adaptation and resilience programs that prioritize equity, and the governance structures that ensure accountability and transparency to taxpayers and to those affected by climate change. From a feminist ethics of care to a rights-based environmental ethics to the philosophy of technology, this question requires us to articulate what counts as a responsible stewardship of common resources, how to balance national development with global responsibility, and how to ensure that policy does not simply shift costs to the most vulnerable. This case invites us to consider the kind of political courage required to implement fair policies in the face of powerful economic interests, and to imagine a world in which cooperation, rather than competition, becomes the organizing principle of climate action. The two sets of case studies in environmental ethics illuminate several core themes. First, they underscore that ethics cannot be reduced to simple formulas when lives and livelihoods are at stake. Rather, they demand a careful balancing of competing goods, a willingness to distribute burdens fairly, and a commitment to protecting the most vulnerable. Second, they reveal how moral theory, whether rooted in justice, care, or rights, must engage with political and economic realities if it is to be meaningful in the public sphere. Third, they demonstrate the importance of intergenerational thinking. The choices we make today do not merely affect our generation, but shape the possibilities available to our descendants. This is not simply a problem of policy design. It is a problem of moral imagination, our ability to see beyond immediate interests to imagine the long arc of human flourishing in a fragile and interconnected world. In weaving the public life sections together, we can cross-reference with a spectrum of ethical frameworks. Environmental ethics offers a lens for considering the rights of future generations and the value of ecosystems beyond their use to humans. Feminist ethics invites attention to justice for marginalized communities and the gendered dimensions of climate vulnerability and resilience. The philosophy of technology helps us scrutinize how innovations either abet our goals of sustainability or distract us with shiny but unsustainable promises. Legal ethics remind us that policy must be grounded in robust rights, due process, and the careful balancing of competing claims. And medical ethics, though not always directly invoked in climate policy, can inform the way we think about public health planning, risk communication, and the ethics of care in communities facing climate-induced health risks. Together, these strands create a robust, integrative approach to ethics in public life, one that honors the dignity and worth of all persons, respects the integrity of ecosystems, and remains accountable to the public for decisions that affect the quality of life now and for generations to come. Before we close, it is helpful to anchor these discussions with historical anecdotes that remind us how we arrived here and how far we have to go. The Hippocratic Oath, with its enduring commitment to the patient's well-being and to the principle of non-maleficence, marks a foundational moment in the professionalization of medical ethics. The oath's spirit has endured, even as the content has evolved with advances in medicine and new understandings of patient rights. The evolution of medical ethics, from paternalism to informed consent, from physician authority to patient autonomy, from hospital-centered care to patient-centered care, reflects a broader historical arc in which professional responsibilities become more transparent and more accountable to those they serve. The rise of professional codes, too, marks a turning point. Professional associations began to articulate standards for practice that could be enforced, shared, and revised as the social stakes shifted. These codes did not merely codify what was permissible. They expressed a collective commitment to public trust, to truth-telling, and to the practice of disciplines with an eye towards social welfare. The Enron saga provides a stark counterpoint to these ideals, reminding us that professional ethics can be compromised when incentives align against truth, accountability, and the public good. The disaster, built on forms of deception, manipulation of accounting practices, and an organizational culture that rewarded risk-taking at the expense of honesty, illustrates how quickly ethical norms can crumble under pressure. It reinforces the essential claim that ethics cannot be left to the slow drift of good intentions. It requires institutional safeguards, transparent reporting, external oversight, and a culture in which dissent is valued as a form of moral competence. Gandhi's nonviolent ethics adds another axis to our historical map. His insistence that social change should be achieved through peaceful means, moral courage, and the transformative power of example remains a potent reminder of how public action can be both ethically radical and practically effective. Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence was not passive. It required discipline, strategic thinking, and a commitment to universal dignity, regardless of one's political aims. His approach demonstrates how ethical commitments in public life can be both principled and pragmatic, capable of mobilizing millions toward justice without resorting to coercion or suspicion. Finally, the rise of professional codes across medicine, law, engineering, and journalism embodies a historical shift toward shared norms designed to protect the vulnerable and to promote integrity in the professions that shape society. These codes are not static. They evolve as new technologies emerge, as social norms change, and as understandings of justice expand. The cross-referencing of these codes with feminist ethics, environmental ethics, and the philosophy of technology shows a dynamic, dialogic moral landscape. We should expect tensions and disagreements, but we should also expect that such tensions can be productive, prompting new conceptual tools, better governance structures, and more robust forms of accountability. The goal is not to eliminate moral conflict, but to create a framework in which conflicts can be engaged with seriousness, humility, and a steadfast commitment to human flourishing. As we bring these threads together, we can imagine how a person, a professional, and a citizen might navigate a single, complex scenario with integrity. Suppose a city contemplates a major infrastructure project that promises economic growth but would entail significant environmental disruption, potential health risks for nearby residents, and long-term climate implications. A physician who lives in the community might be called upon to speak to the health impacts of pollution or to participate in community health planning. A lawyer might be asked to examine the legal rights of affected communities and the procedural fairness of the permitting process. An engineer would need to apply rigorous safety standards and risk assessments to design for resilience and to foresee potential failures. A journalist could investigate the project's background and inform the public with accuracy and clarity while avoiding sensationalism. A public official would need to balance the region's present needs with intergenerational justice, climate commitments, and social equity. In such a case, the cross-disciplinary ethical approach, Beauchamp and Childress's four principles, legal due process, feminist ethics of care, environmental ethics, and the philosophy of technology's attention to power and governance, offers a path to a more responsible decision. One that seeks to maximize benefits while minimizing harm, ensures that affected communities have a voice, distributes costs fairly, and keeps a transparent account of how decisions were made and who bears responsibility for outcomes. It is not a guarantee of perfect outcomes, but it is a robust architecture for acting ethically in practice. To conclude, the journey from theory to practice in ethics is not a straight line, but a web of commitments that cross the intimate and the public, the personal and the political, the old and the new. It requires us to cultivate honesty, generosity, and the courage to face end-of-life questions with humility, to translate ethical ideals into professional practice that respects patient autonomy while guarding against non-maleficence. To apply the hard lessons of history, about codes, about disasters, about nonviolence, to the decisions we make today, and to imagine policy and technology in ways that honor the rights of current and future generations. If we can keep alive a culture of reflection, a readiness to listen, and a willingness to be held accountable by those who are affected by our choices, then we will not merely study ethics as a set of abstract theories. We will inhabit ethics as a way of living, a way of governing, and a way of caring for the world we all share. One more set of echoes, if you will indulge them, can be heard in a few final lines that tie our thread back to primary voices and turning points. The Hippocratic Oath, with its pledge to do no harm, anchors medical practice in an intimate duty to the patient. Yet the oath's spirit evolves. Modern medical ethics would remind us that harm is not only physical. It is also informational, social, and existential, the harm of deception, of neglecting patient autonomy, of ignoring social determinants of health. The Gandhi quotation, "Be the change that you wish to see in the world," is not merely a call to nonviolence in politics. It is a call to moral action in every sphere, to cultivate the inner life to match the outer acts of public engagement, to ensure that our professional decisions reflect the kind of world we hope to create, to resist the lure of expediency when it would betray the dignity of others. And the Enron case is not simply a story about corporate crime. It is a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the necessity of independent oversight, transparent reporting, and ethical leadership that refuses to treat people as mere numbers on a balance sheet. The rise of professional codes, finally, embodies the belief that ethics is a shared project, built through dialogue among peers, checked by accountability, and renewed by ongoing reflection about what it means to act well in a world of uncertainty. As you move through your own life, whether you are making a personal decision about honesty or generosity, working to uphold professional ethics in medicine, law, or engineering, or engaging in public struggles over climate policy and humanitarian concerns, remember that ethics is not an abstract doctrine but a living practice. You will be asked to make choices under pressure, to weigh competing goods, and to participate in a shared project of human flourishing that spans generations. The questions will not yield one universal answer. They will yield a discipline of thought and a habit of care, an ongoing practice of asking, listening, and acting in ways that honor the dignity of every person, the integrity of our professions, and the future of our planet. And in this ongoing practice, we can find a form of calm, reflective action that is the heart of Snooze philosophy. A steady, patient inquiry into what it means to live ethically, deeply, and responsibly in a world that continually challenges us to be better, not just for ourselves, but for others, and for the generations to come. Ethics has never stood still. It moves in conversation, sometimes a slow, introspective hum, sometimes a sharp, clarifying ring. In this segment, we step into the chorus of modern ethical thought, the critiques that challenge the mainstream, the alternatives that propose something different, and the ongoing debates that keep ethical life from settling into a single, dim rulebook. If ethics is a map of how we ought to live, these voices insist there are other routes on the map, other terrains of value to consider, and other landscapes of human life to protect. As we wander through these critiques and their replies, we will meet movies and wars in our imagination, hospitals and laboratories in our case studies, classrooms and courtrooms in the background. We will hear the echoes of Plato and Aristotle in the foreground, the weight of Rawls in the middle, the care-focused voices of Gilligan, Noddings, and Nussbaum, and the challenging provocations of Nietzsche and moral psychologists who study how people actually think and feel when they decide what is right or just. And we will ask again and again what kind of ethics we want to live by, what kind of world it helps create, and how far theory can guide us when the world is messy, partial, and sometimes resistant to universal claims. Let us begin with the big, well-worn family of critiques that shape much of contemporary debate: the utilitarian critique, the deontological critique, and more broadly, the challenge that universal systems face when confronted with human variability, power, and context. We will then move toward Nietzschean horizons, feminist and care-ethical criticisms, virtue-ethical concerns about guidance and cultural variation, and the more radical charge of moral particularism and relativism. For each critique, we will look at two or more real-world contexts: war, justice, healthcare, technology, to see how these concerns press on actual decision-making. We will also offer robust counterarguments or reforms that proponents of the mainstream theories have offered: rules that harness consequences, thresholds and prima facie duties, or care-informed general principles that still aim to protect humanity in a fair and coherent way. And throughout, we will cross-reference with Rawls, with Plato and Aristotle on virtue, with the ethics of care, with moral psychology findings, and with contemporary meta-ethical debates about realism and anti-realism. The aim is not to settle, but to illuminate the fault lines, the possible bridges, and the living texture of ethical life. Let us begin with the utilitarian critique, because it sits at the center of much modern moral philosophy. Utilitarianism offers a powerful motivational engine. The right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or welfare. The appeal is practical and egalitarian in a certain sense. Every person's well-being counts, and the aggregate sum is what matters. Yet within that promise lie tensions that have vexed thinkers for generations. The critiques we will examine, moral luck, the tyranny of the majority, the is-ought gap, and rights-based objections, are not merely technical objections. They are questions about fairness, responsibility, and the texture of human life when outcomes and intentions diverge. First, moral luck. Imagine two surgeons, equally skilled, both trying to save a life in a high-stakes operation. One operation goes smoothly, the patient recovers. The other, by sheer misfortune, ends badly despite every careful precaution. A utilitarian calculus would judge the two surgeons by the outcomes. The first surgeon's act produced happiness, the second's produced harm. But moral luck asks, ought we judge them equally? If outcomes, accidentals of chance, timing, luck, shape moral appraisal, then responsibility seems to hinge on factors beyond the agent's control. Bernard Williams and others argued that a robust theory of ethics must account for the moral weight of intention, character, and the agent's motivational stance, even when results are grim in one case and favorable in another. In Williams's own discussions of moral luck, the intuition is clear. The moral worth of an agent's action shouldn't slide away because luck turned out differently. This critique lands in war too. Consider a pilot who bombs a target that appears strategically sound, but the cost in civilian lives is a tragic accident, an outcome the pilot did not foresee. A straightforward utilitarian tally could feel in the moment that the action was justified by a certain expected balance of welfare. Yet the moral pressure of responsibility for those unintended casualties can feel overwhelming. The same tension arises in healthcare. A physician's decision to treat or not treat a patient, based on odds of survival and resource constraints, might produce a life saved and a life lost, with the moral blame or praise distributed according to outcomes, even when the clinician acted with skill and good intentions. Moral luck pushes us to ask, should ethics rest on the skeleton of outcomes, or should the flesh of intention and virtue hold sway even when outcomes surprise us? Two world-hardened counterarguments emerge here. First, reform utilitarianism via rule utilitarianism. Rather than evaluating every act in isolation, we develop general rules that, on balance, promote welfare when followed. In this view, a rule like "do not intentionally harm innocents" becomes central, because following it tends to maximize happiness across many cases, including those where luck could have gone either way. The second move is to build constraint-based safeguards into the utilitarian calculus, rights and rules that protect basic human goods, even when a particular outcome would look favorable under a simple tally. Thus, we might insist on stringent due process, strict protection of non-combatants in war, or explicit triage protocols that prevent the worst abuses of chance from becoming normative. The point is not to deny luck's role, but to ensure that a theory remains answerable to fairness and human security in the face of luck. The more refined utilitarian positions, in short, acknowledge that we cannot simply count happiness, but we can count procedures and boundaries that tend to respect dignity, even when luck misbehaves. A second major utilitarian concern, the tyranny of the majority. If the aim is to maximize aggregate welfare, one might worry that the majority could crush minority protections in the name of the greater good. History provides chilling illustrations. Policies that, if judged by the aggregate welfare, might appear efficient or stable yet degrade the rights, safety, and flourishing of vulnerable groups. In justice systems and public policy, the fear is that the majority's happiness, perhaps reflected in votes, wealth distribution, or social momentum, could justify egregious harms to minorities. In technology, data-driven welfare calculations could produce outcomes that favor the majority's convenience while leaving minority communities with higher exposure to risk or stigma. The injustice of such a calculus is not merely theoretical, it manifests in real-world decisions about policing, resource allocation, and social surveillance. The utilitarian response here can be nuanced. The reformist program emphasizes robust protections for minority rights as essential components of any welfare-maximizing system. Rule utilitarianism can help. If a rule protects minorities and, as a result, preserves social trust and long-run welfare, then adopting that rule is justified. Another practical response is to incorporate distributional constraints into welfare calculations, not just total happiness. This means caring about how happiness is distributed, who bears burdens, and whether tales of harm are being ignored. In short, the tyranny worry presses utilitarianism to embed justice as a constraint rather than treating it as a mere side effect of maximizing happiness. The Azot gap is the next frontier in the utilitarian critique. Critics argue that a theory grounded in what is or what tends to happen in the world cannot automatically prescribe what we ought to do. If the world's description does not entail normative directions, then a pure welfare calculus might be structurally unable to justify certain crucial duties, like telling us to refrain from exploiting others, or to protect the vulnerable, or to honor promises, without a meta-ethical bridge. When policymakers describe a social system as it is, how incentives, prices, or outcomes actually function, utilitarianism risks becoming descriptive rather than prescriptive. Two examples illustrate this gap in action. In climate policy, is it true that policy should maximize welfare given present technological and economic conditions? If so, what about the obligation to preserve future generations' welfare when these describes long-run dynamics that current technologies cannot fully predict? Or take war and peace. If we describe a military-industrial system as it is, an arena of power, risk, and strategic calculation, how do we derive duties to protect non-combatants and to seek peace without sliding into a cold calculus about aggregate happiness? The critique asks for a bridge, a way to connect empirical descriptions with normative commitments. Proponents answer with two main moves. One, to articulate a robust, forward-looking framework that translates welfare considerations into duties and rights. This is where rule utilitarianism, virtue ethics, or even Rawlsian justice can appear in the utilitarian conversation as allies rather than rivals. The second move is to recognize that normative judgments need a sense of fairness that goes beyond sheer tallies of happiness. This leads to a more pluralistic or hybrid approach. Welfare remains central, but it is constrained, balanced, and interpreted through broader ethical vocabularies, rights, duties, relational commitments, and the protection of human flourishing in a way that is sensitive to context and time. Rights-based objections offer a different kind of critique of utilitarianism. Rights are not merely happiness values, they are protections that individuals may rightly demand or be owed regardless of total welfare. Rights-based objections insist that there are things we should never do, even if adopting them would increase overall happiness. For example, an act that sacrifices an innocent person to save more lives might yield a higher aggregate utility, but a rights-based perspective would resist letting any person's fundamental rights be treated as a mere instrument in the hands of numbers. In wartime, this is stark. The logic of utilitarian calculation could be used to justify extraordinary measures, surveillance, or targeted killings if the resulting welfare is high enough. In healthcare, rights claims, such as the right to life, the right to autonomy, or the right to receive essential care, may resist allocation schemes that hinge purely on probability weights. In technology, privacy rights, consent, and non-discrimination can constrain utilitarian algorithms even if doing so reduces measured welfare. Two robust replies are central here. First, the rights-based critic can be answered by reframing rights as instrumental protections that promote longer-run welfare and social trust. If communities that respect rights tend to be more stable, innovative, and cooperative, then rights have a consequential value that tracks welfare as a broader political good. Second, defenders of utilitarianism can insist on a taxonomy of rights that are carefully protected in the structure of the system, not as exceptions to be traded away. They make room for moral constraints, like a prohibition on harming the innocent, that are justified both by deontic reasoning and by long-run welfare expectations. The idea is not to abolish rights for the sake of utility, but to treat rights as essential boundaries within which welfare calculations operate. In this sense, a sophisticated utilitarianism may be capable of recognizing rights as safeguards, guardrails that keep the overall project from spiraling into coercive or degrading practices. That is not a mere accommodation, it's a reform that aims to preserve both humane treatment and social stability. If we shift from purely utilitarian concerns to Nietzschean critiques, we enter a very different conversation. That universal moral systems may mutilate the vitality of human cultures and individual excellence, flatten difference, and serve the social order rather than the flourishing of individual beings. Nietzsche argued that traditional moral systems, especially those that preach universal duties or equal worth across all times and places, often rest on ressentiment and the herd instinct. In his telling, morality sometimes functions as a compromised system designed to suppress the strong, to normalize average life, to render power into a predictable social instrument. The challenge to universal moral systems is not only about right or wrong in abstract terms, it's about how moral frameworks influence human potential, creativity, and vitality. If we insist that everyone must comply with the same set of universal rules irrespective of context, we may inadvertently hamper people's capacity to grow, to risk, to innovate, or to express will in ways that could, in the long arc, contribute to cultural vitality and human achievement. It's a provocative reminder that moral systems, to be truly alive, must be able to account for difference, aspiration, and even the dangers of conformist morality. Two kinds of responses seek to meet Nietzsche on his own ground without surrendering universal moral ambition. The first is to resist the claim that universality must erase variety. The appeal to universal human capabilities, as developed by Martha Nussbaum, offers a way to hold a universal frame, certain essential freedoms and opportunities that every person should have, while allowing for cultural and individual variation in the means of living those capabilities. The second response is to reinterpret the aim of universal moral ideals not as a prison, but as a scaffold for human flourishing that respects strength and difference. This is where Rawls's notion of reasonable pluralism can be adapted within a Kantian or virtue-ethical architecture. Universal constraints against monstrosities and exploitation, paired with respect for diverse ways of living a good life within those constraints. Nietzsche's challenge in this sense becomes not a rejection of universal ethical aspiration, but a demand that universality be strengthened by depth, by accounts of power, responsibility, and creative freedom that do not smother human possibility. From there we turn to feminist and care ethics, which have become a powerful corrective to what many see as the cold, impersonal reach of traditional moral theories. Feminist ethicists and care theorists critique mainstream ethics for its emphasis on impartial, abstract principles that often overlook the particularities of relationships, dependency, and social context. They argue that morality cannot be fairly understood without attention to how people actually experience vulnerability, dependence, and interdependence in everyday life. In medicine, for instance, care ethics draws attention to the patient-caregiver relationship as a dynamic, responsive process rather than a mere application of universal duties. In justice, it raises concerns about how social institutions propagate or ignore relational obligations, about who counts as a stakeholder in a community and who is largely invisible in policy deliberations. In technology, it shifts the lens toward the human practices of design, the everyday care that must go into ensuring that systems do not harm and that they do respond to real human needs. In wartime, care ethics asks us to consider the people who bear the brunt of conflict, the civilians, the families, the communities, and to resist responses that treat people as mere metrics in a strategic calculation. Two powerful critiques arise here. First, partiality and limited universality. If ethics is grounded in care, it will naturally be partial, concern directed first to those near us, those with intimate ties, those we depend on. Critics worry that care ethics risks endorsing outgroup discrimination or failing to offer universal guidance that can apply across different contexts and cultures. The The second critique concerns the sufficiency of universal guidance. If ethics is largely contingent on relationships and local practices, can it offer a robust, general theory of justice in a globalized world, in healthcare policy, or in the governance of technology? Can it yield commitments that are portable across professions and cultures? Response to these critiques proceeds along two lines. One is to show that care ethics can operate with universalizable dimensions while maintaining its emphasis on particular relations. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach in dialogue with care ethics provides such a synthesis. Its universal commitments to essential capabilities are not cold abstractions, but grounded in vivid recognitions of relational life, vulnerability, and dignity. The central idea is that universal norms can be realized in practice by attention to care and responsive relationships, but without surrendering to mere tribal partiality. The other response is to argue that universalist frameworks need the corrective lens of care to avoid caricatures of abstract justice, to ensure that the institutions crafted in the name of justice actually sustain the goods and needs that make communities livable. In other words, universal principles and care-based attention are not necessarily enemies. They can be mutually reinforcing when care informs how universal duties are realized, and universal constraints guide how care is prioritized when conflicts arise. Virtue ethics then faces its own set of criticisms, that it is vague about action guidance, that it tolerates cultural variation in what counts as virtuous, and that it risks endorsing relativism about norms, either by privileging local traditions or by leaving too much to personal temperament. A common accusation is that virtue ethics offers a portrait of good character, but falls short in telling us how to act in a particular dilemma. If I am confronted with a decision in which two duties pull in different directions, how does virtue ethics equip me to decide what to do? A further challenge is that across cultures, what counts as virtue can diverge. Courage, generosity, honesty, humility may be expressed in different forms in different communities. Does virtue ethics then permit a kind of moral pluralism that dissolves into relativism? One robust reply emphasizes the concept of practical wisdom, or phronses. Aristotle's notion of practical wisdom is not a dry recipe but a skilled, deliberative ability to balance ends, means, and circumstances, to read the particulars of a situation, and to act in a way that expresses a cultivated, harmonious character. This kind of action guidance is not a set of universal rules. It is a cultivated habit of attention and discernment that becomes more reliable with experience, reflection, and community feedback. The virtue ethics rebuttal to the worry about cultural variation is not to deny difference, but to insist that certain core human goods, flourishing, autonomy, dignity, relational responsibility, shape the content of virtuous living across contexts, while the forms those virtues take adapt to local narrative, practice, and tradition. Moreover, contemporary virtue ethics often integrates with other theories. It can incorporate constraints from deontology and utilitarianism, or embed itself within a capability-focused account that seeks universal goods and local virtuosities together. Finally, we arrive at the charge of moral particularism and relativism. The idea here is stark and deliberate. There are no fixed, exceptionless general principles that can guide every moral case. The moral world is too intricate, too governed by context, and too dependent on the particularities of people, relationships, and cultures for blanket rules to capture what is morally salient in every circumstance. Moral particularism argues for case-based reasoning, the value of nuanced judgments in light of similarities and differences between cases, and skepticism about the possibility of universalizable moral theories that can cover every contingency. Two world-tested responses push back. The first is to defend the role of prima facie or aspirational principles, not as rigid commands but as starting points for reflection. We can hold a short list of reasonable considerations, principles such as non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and beneficence, while allowing that in a given case, the weight or relevance of those principles may vary. The second response is to recognize that moral reasoning often operates within a framework of commitments and practices that are not entirely reducible to universal rules, but still demand coherence, justification, and justification to others. The unity of a moral framework, then, may come not from a single global rule, but from a coherent set of norms that a community shares and deliberates about across time. In this sense, moral particularism need not dissolve into relativism. It can coexist with a carefully organized public morality that pays attention to context without surrendering to cultural whim. What counts as a practical plan in response to particularism is to cultivate shared methods of justification, cross-cultural dialogue, and moral education that support reasoned disagreement and continued revision. We can also draw on a Rawlsian reminder, construct principles under a fair veil of ignorance, imagine the constraints of other lives, and test our claims against the possibility of universal application, even when our judgments are sensitive to context. In this manner, particularism pushes ethics to stay alive in the details while still seeking a collective, globally intelligible moral horizon. Having surveyed these critiques and their responses, we now turn to some resonant historical anecdotes that illuminate these debates and that anchor the abstractions in lived historical moments. The first anecdote is about moral luck in the Williams sense. In a famous exchange within moral philosophy, Williams invites us to consider whether we can truly separate motive from outcome when judging an action. The scenario he uses, often called the incident that makes moral luck moral, presents a physician, a pilot, or a driver whose intention is good, yet whose actions end up harming or saving life due to factors outside their control. The anecdote impels us to reflect on how we understand moral responsibility. Do we condemn the agent or the outcome, or both? Williams's argument is not simply to excuse bad outcomes, but to insist that the moral weight of intention cannot be fully erased by luck. The episode invites students of ethics to examine their intuitive responses in the face of uncertain futures, and to consider whether a justice system, in which consequences largely determine blame, would be fair to those whose lives and actions are overshadowed by chance. A second historical anecdote concerns wartime ethics debates, a long and poignant family of conversations that stretch from the trench warfare of the early 20th century to post-war reconstruction and the dawn of the nuclear age. Philosophers and policymakers wrestled with whether strategic bombing could or should be morally justified, how to balance the demands of national survival with the rights and lives of civilians, and what counts as a just cause in a world of total war. In these debates, the utilitarian calculus appeared as a double-edged sword. It could be used to defend harsh decisions if the aggregate welfare seemed to improve. It could also reveal the stark moral danger of sacrificing the vulnerable for purported strategic gains. In those conversations, Rawls's insistence on justice as fairness offered a countermodel. Even when the public mood or strategic necessity calls for hard choices, the rights and dignity of every person must be preserved within a framework that can be publicly debated and morally anchored. The wartime era also saw feminist critique rising in the background, challenging leaders to acknowledge that the civilian harm and the social costs of war are experienced in ways that are gendered and relationally meaningful. The era's debates helped lay the groundwork for contemporary arguments that moral choices in war cannot be reduced to a numeric tally of lives saved. The third anecdote takes us into the rise of feminist ethics and the related development of care ethics, particularly through the work of Carol Gilligan, Nell Noddings, and later Martha Nussbaum in Dialogue with the Capability Approach. Gilligan's critique of standard moral theories, as male-voiced and justice-leaning, argued that women's moral reasoning often centers on relationships, responsibilities, and contexts of care. Nodding's influential insistence that caring relationships, attending to the needs of others, nurturing, responding to vulnerability, provide a direct and powerful form of moral motivation reframed morality away from abstract obligation toward concrete, situation-sensitive responsiveness. Nussbaum's later work then sought to integrate care sensibilities with a universalist account of human flourishing through the capabilities approach. There are certain central capabilities that all humans ought to be able to exercise, but the ways in which societies realize those capabilities will inevitably differ. The historical arc here is instructive. It shows how moral philosophy moved from abstract principles to a more inclusive, relational, and institutionally engaged form of ethics, while still seeking universal human goods that deserve protection and support. A fourth anecdote belongs to the ancient roots of virtue in dialogue with modern reformulations. Plato's and Aristotle's visions of virtue as a kind of teleological excellence continue to haunt contemporary debates. Plato's broader claim, often paraphrased as the idea that knowledge of the good is central to virtuous action, haunts debates about whether virtue can be taught or whether it is an experiential form of wisdom. Aristotle's claim that the good for humans is an activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue invites us to see ethics as a practice that cultivates character through repeated acts, not a mere calculation of consequences. These ancients remind us that the question of what it means to live well is inseparable from questions about how to form a life, how to shape habits, and how to cultivate a perspective that makes sense of competing demands in daily life. We should also bring into view the two most influential streams in metaethics that color these discussions: realism and anti-realism. Realists, in broad terms, hold that there are mind-independent moral facts, features of the world that are true regardless of what anyone thinks. Anti-realists, by contrast, contend that moral truths are constructed, relative, or dependent on attitudes, cultures, or individual stances. The debates over moral psychology, what people actually believe, how they form judgments, and how emotions shape moral reasoning, play a critical role here. The data from moral psychology, including experiments on moral intuition, emotion, and bias, challenge the tidy picture of rational, universalist ethics. They show that human beings reason in context, often with emotion and social conditioning shaping judgments in powerful ways. If ethics is to be something more than a comfortable theory in an armchair, it must account for how people think, feel, and decide under constraint and pressure. The realist-anti-realist debate thus becomes not a mere epistemic quarrel, but a practical concern about how a theory of ethics can guide real people in real institutions. In close relation to these meta-ethical questions are the names that anchor our sense of what ethics could be in a modern, democratic, pluralistic world. Rawls stands as a touchstone for justice grounded in fairness and in a social contract that excludes the arbitrary will of power from the core of political life. Plato and Aristotle offer a powerful, long arc toward virtue that invites us to think about character, education, and the cultivation of rational discernment as a path to living well. The ethics of care expands the horizon by asking whether we can or should account for partial relationships, dependency, and vulnerability as the essential first tests for moral concern. Moral psychology, with its insights into how people actually reason, relates to metaethics by reminding us that the mind is not always a paragon of universal logic, but a living instrument shaped by emotion, context, and social cues. Across all these threads, the critiques and the responses embedded within them create a tapestry, one that suggests that ethical life is not a single scroll of instructions, but a living dialogue about what it means to live with others under pressure and toward a shared but contested and evolving sense of the good. To bring this to life with more texture and texture, we can turn to a few cross-references that deepen the discussion. Cross-reference to Rawlsian justice helps illuminate how a purely happiness-maximizing framework might be tempered by the original position thought experiment and the veil of ignorance, where citizens imagine themselves behind a screen that hides their place in society. This helps us see why universalist rulemaking might be justified not by abstract numbers alone, but by a sense of democratic legitimacy and mutual respect. Plato and Aristotle on virtue give us a perennial sense that ethics is about more than rules. It is about formation, education, and the cultivation of a stable, rational character that can respond well to diverse human situations. The ethics of care shifts attention to relationships and institutions, how hospitals, schools, and workplaces are organized to support care, and how policy design can reflect attentiveness to vulnerability as a central public good. Moral psychology findings remind us that moral reasoning is not a neat, purely logical calculus, but a set of cognitive and emotional processes that can mislead as well as guide. The debates in metaethics, realism versus anti-realism, keep the conversation honest about plasticity and contestation. Are there moral facts independent of our beliefs, or do moral truths arise from our judgments and communities? And in this mix, feminist ethics and care ethics offer a critical corrective to classic theories by insisting that norms and duties must speak to real human lives in concrete situations. As the discussion closes this circle for now, let us pause to reflect on how these debates shape our daily acts and long-term commitments. Consider a healthcare system under strain. Utilitarian reasoning might urge triage to maximize lives saved, but the rights-based critique insists on respecting patient autonomy and non-maleficence. Care ethics demands attention to the relational context, the doctor-patient relationship, the family-needed support, and the social obligations to protect the vulnerable. Virtue ethics asks how clinicians cultivate practical wisdom to guide difficult decisions, and moral particularism would remind decision-makers to weigh the unique stories of each patient rather than apply a blanket rule. In education, the tension surfaces as well. Should curricula be organized around universal moral principles, or should we cultivate character and care-informed reasoning that appreciates student contexts and communities? In the corporate world, debates about whether to prioritize profits or people come to life in policy choices, leadership styles, and governance that need to balance care with accountability, flexibility with standards. Throughout this segment, we have navigated the major criticisms and explored robust counterarguments. We have asked for examples from war, justice, healthcare, and technology, and we have seen how the two tracks of response intersect. The attempt to preserve coherence in the face of critique, and the attempt to broaden the ethical imagination to include care, virtue, context, and human flourishing. We have listened to Nietzsche's siren song about power and vitality, to feminist voices that insist on the centrality of relationships, to care ethics that demand a lived, attentive approach to others, and to virtue foundations that demand practical wisdom in the messy realities of life. We have also attended to the fundamental metaethical questions about whether there are moral facts at all, and if so, how we might know them. In the end, ethics is not a single instrument but a symphony. The critiques remind us that a theory that looks elegant on the page may misread the texture of real human life. The proposed alternatives invite us to listen for different kinds of music. The rhythm of relationships, the cadence of virtues cultivated across generations, the somber notes of duty rightly constrained and rights in place, and the bright chords of a universal human flourishing that respects culture, history, and individuality. The debates in modern ethics are thus not distractions from a pristine truth. They are the living test of how we choose to live together, with courage to acknowledge wrongs, with humility to learn better paths, with care to attend to one another's vulnerability, with wisdom to balance complexity, and with hope that our collective choices can make life more humane. As you continue to explore these debates, keep asking, what is the aim of ethics here? Is it to maximize welfare, to honor rights, to cultivate virtue, to honor care, to respect cultural variation, or to hold fast to a tapestry of universal goods that human beings can aspire toward in common? How do we reconcile the pull of outcomes with the weight of motives and character? How do we build rules and institutions that can withstand the pressure of real life while still treating every person as a bearer of dignity? And what can history teach us about how to keep such a project alive in the face of fear, conflict, and uncertainty? In the next segment, we will turn to more case-driven analysis, dive into 2 or 3 extended scenarios across war, justice, healthcare, and technology, and trace how these ethical theories, critiques, and responses play out in concrete decisions. We will also listen to voices from different traditions and disciplines, incorporating insights from jurisprudence, political theory, psychology, and philosophy of mind. We will return to the central question of how to live well together in a world of limited resources, conflicting loyalties, and imperfect knowledge. And we will do so with a quiet, reflective cadence, the way a thoughtful listener might sit with a difficult question, allowing questions to breathe, and letting the stories of real people illuminate the abstractions of theory. For now, carry with you the sense that ethics is a living practice, one that asks us to balance universal aims with particular lives, to secure both justice and care, to cultivate character while attending to consequences, and to pursue truth while remaining open to revision in light of experience. The debates are hard, the stakes are high, and the work of thinking together has never been more urgent or more human. The future of ethics isn't a single destination we arrive at with a dusty checkbox marked done. It's a living practice, braided into every interface we build, every policy we debate, every classroom we teach, and every decision we outsource to a machine. In this segment, we'll think aloud about how ethics might unfold as technology tightens its grip on daily life, how global justice threads through migrant routes and carbon thresholds, and how moral education can cultivate minds capable of reflective judgment in the face of uncertainty. We'll move through origins to upshots, from aging debates about fairness to the new terrains of AI, data, and ecological responsibility. And we'll do so with stories, historical, contemporary, and hypothetical, that illuminate not just what we should do, but why we find those tasks compelling in the first place. Origins and guiding forces. A steady course set by reason and responsibility, ethics did not begin with the silicon chip, nor did it end with a treaty or a courtroom. Its roots are deeper and broader, a conversation that spans ancient reflections on virtue and justice, through the rationalist turn of the Enlightenment, into the social contract of modern political philosophy, and then into the laboratories and data centers where algorithms now do much of the work of decision-making. If we want to imagine the future of ethics, we must first remember the shape of its past, because how we frame the problem determines the kinds of solutions we permit. In ancient Greece, virtue was a matter of habituated excellence. The good life was the life in which a person's rational capacities are steady and well-tuned in relation to the surrounding practices of community. Aristotle puts the point plainly: the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. The human good, then, is not simply a moment of cleverness or a single right choice. It is an ongoing activity, a character in motion within a network of real human lives. That image of ethical life as practiced excellence, not merely scored on a test, echoes down through the centuries and becomes a stubbornly resilient frame for thinking about modern technology. When we program a machine to perform tasks, we are asking it to participate in a form of practice, and the question becomes, What kind of practice are we inviting into the world? Then the thread tightens with the Enlightenment's insistence that reason can illuminate universal questions about how we ought to live together. The period's commitment to rational inquiry gave birth to a certain confidence that we can design institutions, law, science, markets, education, in ways that treat people as ends in themselves, not merely as means. Socrates' famously piercing claim, "The unexamined life is not worth living," isn't just about personal introspection. It's a challenge to institutions that would leave important questions to habit, inertia, or fear. It invites citizens to keep asking, to keep testing, to keep aligning public practices with what we can justify in the light of reason. In this sense, the ethical imagination is not a static code, but a practice that navigates uncertainty. We learn, we revise, we debate. And as we shift from notebooks to networks, from parchment to pixels, the questions migrate from what is right for a virtuous individual to what is right when a system can learn patterns from millions of data points, when a policy can be optimized by an isolated calculation, when a drone can decide to act or not. The continuity is not in the tools themselves, but in the stubborn demands of judgment. To justify our decisions to others, to respect dignity, to seek fairness, to attend to the consequences of our actions, even when they are mediated by machines. Let's pause and mark a few guiding thinkers who ground this conversation. Kant's imperative of universalizability, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, opens a path to think about AI not merely as a tool, but as a system that can be treated as a policy environment with its own moral laws to uphold. The principle asks for a test. Would the rule you follow in designing a technology be acceptable if everyone adopted it? If not, rethink the rule before you push a button that scales its effects globally. From Aristotle, we inherit the sense that ethical life requires cultivation and practical wisdom, the habit of balancing virtues in real situations rather than ticking off a list of duties. From Socrates, we take the call to critical self-examination, a discipline that becomes essential when we outsource judgment to automated agents. And from John Stuart Mill, we inherit a robust reminder about autonomy. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, a principle that becomes contested ground in a world where data and surveillance reach into the most intimate corners of life. Key thinkers and arguments as a map for the future. To think clearly about the ethical futures of technology and global interdependence, we need to keep a few ideas in view as touchstones and as conversation partners. First, deontological intuitions insist that some acts are wrong regardless of their outcomes. In AI governance, this translates into duties not to lie with the data, not to treat people as mere means in optimization problems, and not to compromise essential rights even when doing so would yield higher efficiency or profit. Kant's call for universalizable maxims helps structure debates about transparency, consent, and accountability. If we bake a rule into a system, say that a classifier must always respect the consent of the person whose data is being used, then we must examine whether that rule would hold under scaling, whether it remains workable in emergent contexts, and whether exceptions would erode the principle. Second, consequentialist and utilitarian lines push us toward evaluating outcomes, but with a careful eye to distribution. The global justice concerns we face today, migration, poverty, climate change, cultural diversity, make it difficult to separate ethics from politics. John Rawls, among others, offers us a method for thinking about fairness under uncertainty and social cooperation, especially the idea that social structures should be arranged to benefit the least advantaged and to preserve basic liberties. In a world of algorithms, this translates into designing systems that do not systematically disadvantage the vulnerable, that provide interpretable justifications for decisions, and that create channels for redress when things go wrong. Third, virtue ethics calls us back to the character of institutions and to the cultivation of habits that support reflective judgment. If we are constructing technologies that shape perception, memory, and social interaction, then the moral fabric of the communities that build and use those technologies matters deeply. The care ethics that feminist philosophers highlight, emphasizing dependency, relationality, and responsibility, pushes back against impersonal optimization by insisting that ethical life is formed within networks of care, dependence, and reciprocity. Finally, the philosophy of technology helps us see that technology is not a neutral domain. Martin Heidegger warned that technology's essence is not equipment, but a way of revealing the world in a particular frame, and in framing that orders nature as resource to be counted, stored, and controlled. If that view is anywhere near accurate, then the ethical task is not simply to program better algorithms, but to question the frame itself. What counts as knowledge, what gets represented, who gets heard, and who bears risk. Two concrete future scenarios and their ethical gravities. Scenario 1. Alignment and accountability in high-stakes systems. Imagine 2035 in a large city. An AI-powered triage and resource allocation system governs hospital operations. It schedules surgeries, prioritizes patients for scarce ICU beds after multiple algorithms weigh prognosis, social factors, and predicted adherence to postoperative care. The system has been praised for reducing wait times and improving overall survival metrics. Yet a cascade of incidents, delays in emergency care for a non-dominant language group, a misestimated prognosis for a marginalized patient with complex comorbidities, and a computer-generated rationing rule that deprioritized older patients in a way that mapped closely onto a regional demographic pattern, begins to unravel public trust. Ethical considerations here are layered. First, there is the question of alignment. Do the system's encoded values reflect the community's moral commitments? If the rule says save the most lives, is that enough? Or do we need to ask whether the system can also attend to justice across social groups, disability, language access, and historical disadvantage? Kant would push us to ensure that the decision rule could be universalized in a just society, and that people are treated as ends, not merely as means to improved throughput. But to translate this into a hospital setting, we need concrete institutional safeguards, human-in-the-loop oversight for each critical triage decision, transparent audit trails for how efficiency metrics were balanced against equity concerns, and meaningful avenues for redress when a patient or family believes the system has erred. Second, there is the risk of opacity. If the model's internal reasoning is inscrutable, how do clinicians explain to families why a life-sustaining intervention was denied? This touches epistemology and cognitive science. Human minds rely on explainability, narrative coherence, and causal reasoning. If we demand machine explanations that satisfy a layperson's sense of causation, we push for transparency that is not only legally required but philosophically intelligible. We might borrow from the practice of clinical ethics committees and require that at critical junctures, decisions be reviewed by a diverse panel trained to assess algorithmic reasoning, bias, and the fairness of evidence used. Third, the question of accountability will be central. If a decision to deprioritize a patient is traceable to a line of code written by a data scientist who bears responsibility, the designer, the hospital, the administrators who deployed the system, or the broader system of public policy that incentivized efficiency. The principle that the buck stops with the user becomes messy when the user has thousands of lines of code between intention and impact. We will need robust accountability mechanisms, perhaps modeled on those in safety-critical industries. Independent auditing bodies, enforceable standards, and the possibility of decommissioning or recalibrating a system when harm is demonstrated. Fourth, the global justice layer enters. A hospital in a wealthy district may survive such a crisis by shifting resources to the sickest cases that promise the greatest societal benefit under the algorithm. A hospital in a poorer district might face chronic under-resourcing that makes it harder to achieve those same metrics. If we do not attend to how these systems operate across geographies, we risk importing or hardening existing inequalities. The questions: who has access to AI-enabled healthcare? Who controls the data about communities? What kinds of biases are baked into the data that train the models? Are not merely technical, they are moral and political. Ethical considerations in this scenario center on how to ensure universalizable rules in a multi-stakeholder system, how to preserve human dignity and autonomy in the face of machine efficiency, how to ensure transparency and accountability, and how to align system design with commitments to equity and the vulnerable. The scenario invites us to test and refine Rawlsian fairness concepts in the era of predictive medicine, to translate Kantian universalizability into governance practices for clinical AI, and to invite virtue ethics into the design and deployment of systems that people must live with daily. Scenario 2, climate justice, intergenerational obligation, and policy design. The second scenario unfolds not in a hospital, but in a coastal city negotiating sea level rise, and in a country negotiating its technology and industry transitions. A climate justice policy is on the table that seeks to allocate responsibility for emissions reductions across generations and across borders, while respecting cultural diversity and indigenous sovereignty. Imagine a policy bundle that includes carbon pricing, adaptation investments, transfer payments to the most climate-vulnerable communities, protections for workers displaced by the transition to a green economy, and a robust data regime to monitor transparency and accountability. Ethical concerns here are multi-layered. First, intergenerational justice demands that present generations not consign foreseeable harms to the future as a cheap cost of doing business today. we can borrow a Rawlsian intuition. The rules should be chosen behind a veil of ignorance about one's own eventual place in the distribution of benefits and burdens. Yet this is not just a hypothetical exercise. The policy must operationalize obligations to future people who cannot speak for themselves, and it must do so in ways that are credible and enforceable. Second, climate justice is not evenly distributed across geographies or identities. Polluter nations, energy-exporting regions, and marginalized communities bear different burdens and have different capacities to respond. Nozick's and Rawls' debates about liberty and distributive justice collide here with a more complex planetary scale. We need mechanisms to ensure that wealthier, high-emitting countries and corporations shoulder more of the burden, and that transition costs do not erase the gains in human development that many climate-vulnerable populations have achieved. We also need to respect cultural diversity and indigenous sovereignty. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent, embodied in UNDRIP, must be integrated into resource management and policy implementation wherever indigenous lands or rights are implicated. Third, the ecological dimension asks us to adopt a sense of responsibility for the non-human world. Ecological responsibility requires that we treat ecosystems and species as stakeholders in our moral universe, not merely resources to be exploited. Philosophers of technology remind us that our tools shape our perception of nature. Climate policy, too, must be designed to cultivate a more humble relationship with the Earth rather than a command-and-control mindset that sees nature as a problem to be bent to human will. Fourth, there is the political epistemic challenge of uncertainty. Climate forecasts are probabilistic, models are contested, and policy effectiveness depends on cooperation across borders. Cognitive science teaches that people struggle with probabilistic reasoning and risk assessment under uncertainty, and that cognitive biases can color beliefs about climate risk and policy effectiveness. A robust approach, therefore, requires not only empirical analysis but transparent, pluralistic deliberation that makes room for dissenting voices and for the slow, iterative process of policy refinement. Two practical elements stand out in this climate justice scenario. One is the structure of compensation and capability building. Wealthier nations can offer climate finance to help developing regions adapt and transition, ensuring that the burden of decarbonization does not fall on the most vulnerable first and hardest. This aligns with a political philosophy of global distributive justice that looks beyond the borders of any single nation for moral responsibility. The other element is the governance architecture that legitimates and monitors the policy. Independent oversight bodies, participatory processes that involve civil society and indigenous communities, and transparent reporting on outcomes. This is not merely administrative. It is an ethical commitment to political inclusion and to the legitimacy of collective decisions made in the face of uncertain futures. A short litany of the ethical considerations in this climate scenario would include justice across generations, justice between nations and within nations, respect for indigenous rights and cultural diversity, humility before ecological limits, accountability for policymakers and businesses, transparency in the reporting of risks and outcomes, and a commitment to adaptive governance that can revise course as evidence and circumstances change. It is easy to fall into a technocratic trap here, believing that numbers, models, and markets will automatically yield fair outcomes. The countervailing temptation is to let moral imagination lag behind technical possibility, to mistake policy elegance for justice. The ethical task is to keep both in view. To design policies that are technically sound, politically legitimate, and morally robust. From here to today's practice, applications, interpretations, and cross-disciplinary threads ethics in practice now moves through many doors. In data privacy and surveillance, the questions are not simply about whether we can collect data but whether we ought to, and under what constraints. Algorithmic fairness has become a field of study in policy, asking how to detect bias, ensure representation, and establish accountability for automated decisions that affect lives in healthcare, housing, lending, and policing. In ecological responsibility, we are learning to treat sustainability as a core dimension of justice rather than a luxury add-on. And in moral education, there's a growing emphasis on reflective habits, empathy, and critical thinking as capacities that technology alone cannot cultivate. Two concrete examples help illuminate how these ideas translate into real-world practices and how they become cross-referenced with other domains of philosophy and science. First example. Algorithmic bias in employment screening. Consider an AI system used by a large corporation to screen candidates for software engineering roles. It analyzes resumes, social media signals, and performance data from prior hires. The system claims to optimize for the best fit, but the database from which it learns is riddled with historical biases, underrepresentation of women in STEM, regional disparities, and the residual effects of unequal access to education. The ethical questions here are not just about performance metrics, they are about fairness, dignity, and the social meaning of opportunity. A deontological stance would demand that we treat all applicants as ends in themselves, not as means to a deficient fit score. A consequentialist approach would examine patterns of disparate impact and the long-run effects on the workforce. A virtue ethics frame would stress the character of the organization. Are we cultivating a culture that values inclusion and growth, or one that tacitly endorses bias as a cost of efficiency? This example also probes the epistemology of judgment under uncertainty. The system's predictions are probabilistic. The decision about whom to hire cannot rest on absolute certainty about a person's future performance. Cognitive science reminds us that human decision-makers rely on heuristics, and that automated systems can encode and amplify biases in unexpected ways. A robust response is to require explainable AI that can justify decisions to applicants, to implement auditing for bias across demographic groups, to maintain human oversight at critical decision points, and to provide redress pathways for those who believe they have been harmed. The cross-reference with political philosophy comes in when we consider who bears responsibility for the policies that allow such systems to operate and how to ensure governance that is democratic and accountable. Second example. Data privacy in health and wearables. Wearable devices collect intimate health data, location data, and patterns of behavior. The ethical challenge is to balance potential benefits, early detection of health issues, personalized medicine, and public health insights, with the right to privacy and bodily autonomy. The Enlightenment impulse toward universalizable rules supports a standard of consent and transparency. Individuals should know what data are collected, how they will be used, who will have access, and how long data will be stored. But universal rules must be adaptable to context. Some communities may value privacy differently, and indigenous data sovereignty demands that data about indigenous peoples be governed by their own communities, not merely by external researchers or corporations. The feminist critique of traditional bioethics adds another layer. Care ethics invites us to consider how data collection and use affect relationships, vulnerability, and the responsibilities of caregivers, clinicians, and scientists to those whose data are being used. In this example, the ethical terrain also intersects with epistemology and cognitive science. How does one interpret health data that is distributed across devices, pharmacies, clinics, and social networks? How reliable are the inferences drawn from such data in terms of accuracy and fairness? And how does one design governance that remains legitimate under shifting technology and evidence? The policy answer then includes robust data governance regimes with explicit consent, clear purposes, and revocability, independent oversight to prevent abuse, and participatory design processes that include patient groups, community representatives, and privacy advocates. The broader lesson is that the future of ethics in data-rich contexts hinges on transparent justification, accountability for decisions, and a commitment to human dignity even when the data economy promises powerful benefits. Theoretical cross-references, where philosophy, technology, politics, and cognitive science meet cross-referencing ideas across disciplines, is essential when we face technology's vast reach. Philosophy of technology invites us to examine how our tools shape our ends, the frames we adopt, the questions we ask, and the kinds of worlds we imagine. Political philosophy directs attention to justice, legitimacy, and the distributional effects of policy choices, especially in a hyper-connected world where flows of people, capital, and information do not respect borders. Epistemology asks us to scrutinize the basis of our beliefs and the reliability of our evidence in a world where uncertainty is not an exception but a constant. Cognitive science sheds light on how humans reason under pressure, how biases arise, and how decision support systems can be designed to align with human cognitive strengths and limitations. Together, these disciplines guide us to ask not simply what we ought to do, but how we can know what we ought to do, and how to organize communities so that good judgments become everyday practices rather than rare exceptions. For example, in models of judgment under uncertainty, dual process theories remind us that people rely on fast, intuitive judgment, System 1, and slower, more deliberate reasoning, System 2. In high-stakes governance, we need a design that respects both. Systems that provide quick, reliable signals for urgent decisions, but that invite deliberate scrutiny and moral reflection when the stakes are high or the data are contested. A note on education: cultivating reflective habits, empathy, and critical thinking If we want to prepare future generations for ethical living in a technological world, we must rethink moral education as a disciplined practice of judgment, not a memorization of rules. The educational aim is to cultivate three capacities: reflective habit, empathetic understanding, and critical thinking. Reflective habit is the disciplined practice of pausing to examine motives, assumptions, and potential consequences. Empathy is the capacity to imagine the lives of others, especially those who stand outside our immediate circles, and to recognize their legitimate claims. Critical thinking is the habit of questioning evidence, evaluating arguments, and recognizing biases, both in one's own thinking and in the information that tech systems present. Historically, Enlightenment education emphasized inquiry, public reasoning, and the development of rational autonomy. Today, we can reframe that project as ethical literacy for a data-driven age. Learning how to interpret statistics without surrendering to cynicism, learning how to read policy proposals for fairness and accountability, learning how to participate in democratic deliberation when algorithms shape public discourse. Feminist and indigenous critiques offer precise guidance here. The feminist critique invites us to center care, vulnerability, and relational responsibility. Indigenous critiques call for sovereignty, consent, and an ethics of stewardship that respects relations with land, water, and non-human beings. Together, they expand the scope of moral education beyond individual rights toward relational and ecological responsibilities. Two modern anecdotes that illuminate contemporary policy shaping. First, consider the feminist critique of moral development theories and medical ethics, which reoriented policy discussions toward care, context, and vulnerability. In the late 20th century, feminist scholars challenged the dominant models of moral reasoning that emphasized abstract universality and impersonal calculations. Carol Gilligan's work, In a Different Voice, argued that women's moral reasoning often centers on relationships, care, and responsibility in particular contexts rather than on abstract rules. This shift helped reshape bioethics, healthcare delivery, and even technology design to better account for caregiving roles, social vulnerability, and the everyday ethics of households, clinics, and communities. The policy implications have rippled into hospital practices, patient consent processes, and the design of assistive technologies that must respect the personhood, autonomy, and well-being of those who may lack voice in formal decision-making. Second, indigenous critiques and policy responses in the digital and ecological realms have shifted thinking about consent, data sovereignty, and land rights. Across many nations, indigenous scholars and communities have pressed for recognition of sovereignty and the right to govern data about their communities and lands. The concept of two-eyed seeing, honoring both indigenous and Western ways of knowing, has informed policy discussions about climate adaptation, natural resource management, and education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in various countries have produced policy reforms aimed at educational inclusion, repatriation of cultural artifacts, and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge systems into policy design. In the climate arena, indigenous leadership has been decisive in highlighting local knowledge of ecosystems, informing resilient strategies that are culturally appropriate, and arguing that justice must include the protection of sacred sites and the respect for treaty rights. Two historical anecdotes that illuminate the Enlightenment rationality and professional ethics codes. First anecdote, the Enlightenment's invitation to public reason. In the 18th century, Voltaire and colleagues argued that society's progress depends on the uncoerced use of reason by ordinary citizens, not just by scholars and princes. The call to public reason was an invitation to democratize epistemic authority, to distrust superstition and arbitrary power, and to place moral diplomacy in the realm of accessible argumentation. It's useful to remember that this was not merely a philosophical debate, it was a program for institutional reform. Presses, academies, salons, and universities became sites where reason could be tested, debated, and refined. The phrase, "What is enlightenment?" as Kant would later frame it in his essay by that name, is a banner for a tradition that imagines the public square itself as a moral instrument. That tradition provides a historical precedent for insisting that new technologies, especially those with global reach, be subjected to public justification, open debate, and channels of accountability. Second anecdote, the rise of professional ethics codes in medicine and engineering. The modern era saw the codification of professional duties as a response to the ethical complexity of practice. The medical profession in particular moved from a craftsman's honor to a codified obligation. Patient welfare, non-malfeasance, confidentiality, and informed consent became formalized expectations. The American Medical Association and other professional bodies crafted codes that guided practitioners, when faced with moral dilemmas that technical skill alone could not resolve. The development of these codes represents a turning point in which ethics became an institutional, standard-setting enterprise rather than an individual moral stance alone. This historical moment helps us understand why today's AI developers, data scientists, and policymakers must also operate within ethical codes, auditing standards, and professional norms that transcend personal belief and align with shared commitments to human welfare and justice. Two modern anecdotes that illuminate feminist and indigenous shaping of policy. First modern anecdote, the care-centered turn in technology ethics and policy. In hospital ethics committees and in the design of care-oriented technologies, feminist critiques of impersonal, efficiency-focused decision-making have gained traction. The shift toward patient-centered care, relational autonomy, and an emphasis on consent, privacy, and dignity reflect this influence. In AI policy debates, the care lens prompts us to question not just whether a system can optimize a process, but whether it respects the lived experiences of people in vulnerable positions, patients, caregivers, and families who navigate hospital systems, palliative care decisions, or chronic illnesses. This turn helps ensure that technologies serve human flourishing in ways that align with our deepest commitments to relational well-being. Second modern anecdote, indigenous knowledge and governance in policy design. The real-world impact of indigenous critiques can be seen in the incorporation of consent frameworks for research, data sovereignty principles for data collection and use, and co-management approaches to land and resource policy. These developments challenge purely technocratic solutions by insisting on social legitimacy and cultural autonomy as prerequisites for policy success. The two-eyed seeing approach has influenced how civil society and policymakers think about climate adaptation, education, and cultural preservation, fostering policies that are more participatory, more respectful of diverse ways of knowing, and more resilient over time because they embed local knowledge and values from the outset. Cross-referencing with other disciplines for depth, our exploration of ethics in the age of AI, data, and climate is not a closed loop of philosophy alone. It is a conversation with the philosophy of technology, political philosophy, epistemology, and cognitive science about judgment under uncertainty. The philosophy of technology helps us reflect on how technologies shape our perception of risk, the social imaginary we deploy around progress, and the institutions that govern invention. Political philosophy grounds concerns about fairness, legitimacy, and the distribution of burdens and benefits in a globalized world. Epistemology challenges us to examine how we know what we know when data streams are abundant, noisy, and contested. Cognitive science offers empirical insight into how people reason, decode probabilities, and respond to uncertainty, bias, and complexity. Together, these disciplines provide a toolkit for thinking about the future of ethics as an integrated practice rather than a set of separate debates. They encourage us to adopt governance models that are transparent and participatory, to design technologies that reflect justice and care, and to educate young minds to think deeply about what kind of world they want to bring into being. Quotations as signposts and reminders throughout this reflection. A few compact quotations from primary sources can serve as steady reminders of enduring commitments. From Immanuel Kant. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This line invites us to test the rules behind our automated systems, algorithms, and policies against a universalizable standard. From Aristotle, the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. The ethical life is a continuous practice in which character and disposition matter, not just outcomes. From Socrates, as recorded in Plato's Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. We are called to keep examining our assumptions, especially when the stakes are social, technological, and planetary. From John Stuart Mill, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Individual autonomy is essential, but its exercise must consider others and collective implications. From Confucius Analects, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. A timeless reminder that moral reciprocity should guide our policies, including those that govern digital and ecological domains. The practical takeaway. A living moral education for a connected world. If there is a through line across these threads, it is this. Ethics is not a static instruction manual, but a dynamic practice that must be taught, tested, and revised. The future of ethics, especially in relation to technology and global justice, depends on three interlocking commitments. First, a commitment to public justification and accountable governance. When systems, whether in health, policing, or climate policy, affect millions, decisions must be justifiable in a way that ordinary people can understand and critique. The justification must be testable, open to revision, and capable of incorporating new evidence and diverse perspectives, including those of communities most affected by the decisions. Second, a commitment to care and justice in relation. A future ethics that prizes empathy and relational responsibility will not treat individuals as interchangeable data points. It will recognize vulnerability, protect privacy, and attend to the ways in which policies and technologies shape social bonds, family life, and community resilience. Feminist and indigenous contributions remind us that ethics must work within relationships of care and solidarity, not merely within abstract calculations of utility or efficiency. Third, a commitment to education that cultivates judgment under uncertainty. A technologically saturated world demands a citizenry capable of reflective reasoning, critical evaluation, and resilient, adaptable behavior. This means reforming curricula at all levels to integrate philosophy of technology, ethics of AI, climate justice, and cross-cultural understandings into the core. It means teaching not only what to think, but how to think, how to question evidence, how to interpret policy proposals, how to navigate dissent, and how to act with moral courage in times of ambiguity. A closing reflection in the form of a question as we contemplate the future of ethics in an era of intelligent machines, global flows, and ecological fragility, we can ask a simple but pressing question. What kind of judgment do we want to inhabit the next generation with? Do we want to equip them with a toolbox of rules that can be applied without reflection, or with a practice of discernment that accepts complexity, invites empathy, and requires accountability? The answer will determine not only the policies we enact, but the kind of people we become. Citizens who can hold a skeptical, hopeful conversation with technology while staying loyal to basic commitments to justice, dignity, and care. If you're listening for a short, crisp takeaway, here it is. Ethics in the 21st century must be navigational, relational, and participatory. It must honor universal claims about human dignity while recognizing cultural diversity. It must protect individual autonomy without dissolving into techno-paternalism. It must balance pragmatic decision-making with the humility to recognize that not all futures can be predicted or controlled. And it must educate minds in a way that makes judgment under uncertainty not a crisis but a practiced art. As we close this segment, consider the words of those who have long argued for a reasoned, compassionate, and just approach to fragile life. The history of ethics teaches us that reason without empathy becomes cold calculation, and empathy without reason becomes sentiment. Our task is to fuse the two into a mature practice of moral judgment that can face the unknown without surrendering the vulnerable to chance. The future of ethics depends on it, the future of technology depends on it, the future of global justice depends on it, and the future of education depends on our willingness to teach and to learn this delicate art, how to think with care, how to argue with clarity, and how to act with responsibility in a world that is becoming closer and more complex every day.